Welcome to the royal court, where the good news is you're indoors, and the bad news is you're one wrong bow away from unemployment. If you've ever wondered what it's like to live in a place where every move, breath, and blink requires strategic planning, congratulations. Forget modern office politics. Royal courts perfected the art of subtle warfare centuries before anyone invented HR. Here, etiquette wasn't just a guideline. It was the currency, the weapon, the armor, the resume, and the exit strategy wrapped into one. Hello travelers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you're listening to this, and hit the subscribe button. But only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. To understand why etiquette mattered so much, imagine a world without emails, text messages, or discreet gossip group chats. Your status was communicated entirely through physical signals, eyebrow twitches, bow angles, how tightly you held your fan, how gently you placed your goblet down, and whether you dared to look the monarch directly in the face without first consulting a mental rulebook the size of a cathedral. The court was essentially a live-action performance in which everyone was trying to be the star, while pretending not to be trying at all. Subtlety was the throne's favourite sport. But what exactly was the royal court? Think of it as the monarch's combination office, social club, talent show, rumour factory, fashion runway, and extremely judgmental family reunion. It was the place where decisions were made, alliances were forged, and people silently panicked about whether their bow was too shallow. At any given moment, the court could contain nobles, ambassadors, servants, diplomats, artists, spies disguised as one of the aforementioned categories, and that one cousin nobody trusted but couldn't get rid of because he technically owned half a duchy. The primary purpose of the court was to stay near the monarch, not out of affection, but out of necessity. If you weren't visible, you weren't influential. If you weren't influential, you weren't powerful. And if you weren't powerful, well, good luck surviving a world where the job market consisted of landowner, soldier, or person hoping the plague doesn't come back this year. Being at court meant proximity to authority, which often meant wealth, as long as you didn't commit the fatal mistake of existing in a way that annoyed the sovereign. And this is where etiquette became the ultimate weapon. A single misstep could send you crashing down the ladder of social importance faster than a dropped goblet rolling across a banquet hall. Raise your eyes too quickly when the monarch enters. Arrogant. Hesitate too long when called upon. Suspicious. Walk too confidently. Threatening. Walk too softly. Weak. In other words, the perfect courtier moved with the precision of a well-trained cat. Silent, graceful, and deeply aware that one wrong paw could mean exile. Different courts across the world had their own unique quirks. In the French court of Versailles, etiquette mutated into a competitive sport. Everyone tried to stand closer to the king, not out of love, but because whoever stood nearest got first access to royal favour, gossip, and occasionally the opportunity to hand the king his shirt, a job more sought after than most modern internships. The closer you were, the more valuable you became. The farther you were, the more likely you were to die poor and unnoticed, possibly eaten by your own decorative garden maze. Meanwhile, the Chinese imperial court operated like a sacred machine, with rituals so elaborate that even experienced officials needed years to memorize them. Entire manuals were dedicated to the precise angle at which one must bow before the emperor, the appropriate phrasing to use when presenting a request, and the correct way to survive the honour of being in the Son of Heaven's presence without collapsing from nerves. Here, etiquette wasn't merely politeness, it reflected cosmic order. If you messed up, the universe didn't just frown at you, it squinted in your direction like a disappointed grandparent. The Ottoman court at Topkapi Palace had its own brand of etiquette, focused heavily on hierarchy and respect, especially in the presence of the Sultan. Silence was golden, literally. Courtiers known as the mute attendants were trained not to speak, which made them excellent at navigating a court where saying the wrong thing could end your career so quickly it didn't even have time to flash before your eyes. Here, The art of communication relied heavily on gestures, nods, and the ability to convey "I am loyal," using only eyebrow position. But regardless of the culture, one rule remained universal. The court was a spectacle, and you were always being watched, not by a handful of people, but by everyone. Nobles watched each other, servants watched nobles, ambassadors watched for weaknesses, while spies watched ambassadors watching nobles watching servants. It was a never-ending cycle of mutual observation, like a reality show where nobody had privacy, and everyone secretly hoped their rival would trip on the palace steps. This constant observation meant that etiquette served a dual purpose. It kept order and it revealed character. Did you bow too slowly? You were arrogant. Did you bow too quickly? You were desperate. Did you bow too deeply? You were mocking someone. Did you not bow at all? You might as well pack your bags. This pressure created an atmosphere where courtiers practiced their gestures like Olympic athletes. Some trained with mirrors. Others trained with instructors. A few probably trained with therapists, though in most centuries those therapists were disguised as priests or very patient dogs. But perhaps the strangest thing about royal etiquette is that it worked. It kept people in line. It reinforced power. It built an entire culture of ritual, symbolism, and unspoken rules that outlived kingdoms themselves. Etiquette, with all its absurdities, kept the court running smoothly, or at least looking smooth enough that outsiders didn't notice the cracks until the kingdom was already mid-collapse. And so, in the royal court, etiquette wasn't just behaviour. It was survival. It was identity. It was the quiet, constant performance of loyalty under the glow of chandeliers and the suspicious gaze of a monarch who trusted absolutely no one. If you think greeting someone is as simple as nodding your head or muttering, "Hey," please leave that thought at the door. In a royal court, greetings weren't greetings. They were performances, calculations, spiritual events, and occasionally dramatic collapses disguised as unexpected acts of devotion. Bowing and curtsying weren't optional. They were the oxygen of court life. If you didn't do them correctly, people didn't just raise eyebrows. They raised questions about your loyalty, your upbringing, your bloodline, and possibly whether you'd been raised by wolves. Let's begin with the basics. Bows and curtsies communicated everything: rank, reverence, religious piety, political allegiance, whether you planned to cause a rebellion, whether you regretted your sins, or whether you were simply trying to avoid being publicly scolded by a chamberlain with a moustache sharp enough to slice cheese. A bow wasn't just a bend. It was an entire conversation conveyed through posture. And a curtsy wasn't just a dip. It was a physical paragraph explaining your awareness of social hierarchy. Different courts had different rules, but they all agreed on one universal truth. Gravity was the enemy. A bow too deep could topple you. A curtsy too ambitious could make you resemble a folding chair collapsing in slow motion. Every courtier lived with the constant fear of losing balance, because nothing destroyed reputations faster than falling over in front of the monarch. People have survived wars, plagues and assassinations, but nobody survived the embarrassment of a public royal wobble. In European courts, especially in places like France, Spain and England, the bow became an art form. There were morning bows, which were gentle and respectful. There were evening bows, which were more formal, as if your spine were apologising for the sins you'd committed during lunch. There were bows reserved for formal audiences, taller bows for informal audiences, and terrifying bows for when the monarch was in a bad mood. If the king was happy, you bowed at a comfortable angle. If the king was furious, you bent low enough to examine your own shoes, a sign of respect or self-preservation depending on who you asked. Curtsies were equally dramatic. Women trained from childhood to lower themselves with elegance, control, and the illusion that skirts weighing 20 pounds were feather-light. The trick was to descend slowly, gracefully, and without locking your knees, which could turn a curtsy into a feint. Ladies practiced in private chambers, sometimes with instructors, sometimes with supportive friends, and sometimes with long-suffering maids who had to catch them mid-fall. A perfect curtsy was worth more in court than a well-written poem or a small political alliance. A bad curtsy, however, became gossip quicker than wildfire. Asian courts had their own complexities. In Japan, court etiquette demanded bows of precise angles, 15 degrees for casual respect, 30 degrees for more formal interactions, and 45 degrees for profound reverence. Anything deeper than 45 degrees was essentially you confessing to every mistake you'd ever made. Samurai bowed with measured grace, ensuring their swords didn't clatter, because nothing said "I'm a threat to your dynasty" like an accidental weapon sound. Meanwhile, in Korea and China, kneeling bows were used in imperial courts, lowering the body to emphasize humility. Some were so deep that people joked the floor became the most intimate acquaintance of their foreheads. Failures were legendary. One Dutch ambassador tripped mid-bow in Versailles, turning the dip into a dramatic forward lunge that nearly sent him flying into Louis XIV's lap. Court chroniclers described it as a moment of unintended closeness. In England, a noble woman curtsied so enthusiastically that she lost her balance and disappeared completely under her own skirt like a startled ostrich burying itself in despair. The Queen maintained her composure, but witnesses swore her eyes sparkled with the kind of joy only aristocratic chaos could bring. Because disasters like these were common, etiquette instructors emerged as the unsung heroes of the court, part ballet coach, part strategist, part therapist. Their job was not only to train courtiers to bow and curtsy properly, but to ensure they had the physical stability of a well-rooted tree. They corrected posture, adjusted angles, polished footwork, and reminded students not to lock their joints unless they wanted to descend like a collapsing puppet. Some even specialized in emergency bow recovery, a technique designed for moments when gravity betrayed you. Step 1. Extend one foot subtly backward. Step 2. Shift your weight. Step 3. Pretend it was all part of an elaborate ritual. Professionals could turn a near fall into an impressive flourish as though they were blessing the floor with their presence. But bows and curtsies weren't only about technique, they were a language. A shallow bow could express irritation. A too deep bow could signal desperation. A curtsy held for too long could suggest you were trying to impress the monarch, flirt with them, or dramatically prove your loyalty. Everything had meaning. Courtiers knew that monarchs judged them not only with their eyes, but with the full power of palace gossip networks. There were even rules about whether you should maintain eye contact while bowing. In some courts, looking directly at the monarch while bending was considered bold. In others, it was allowed, but only after you reached the lowest point, as if saying, "I submit, but not too much." And then there were the penitence bows, used after you'd offended someone important. These were deeper, slower, slightly tragic, and usually accompanied by expressions of humility so dramatic they bordered on theatrical. Advisors often spent hours practicing these, because nothing was more dangerous than apologizing incorrectly in a royal court. Ultimately, bowing and curtsying were more than rituals. They were survival strategies. In a world where monarchs had absolute power, gestures mattered. Posture mattered, balance mattered. You weren't just lowering your body, but you were navigating a labyrinth of expectations, traditions, and unspoken rules that determined your future. And as every nervous courtier learned, the first rule of royal etiquette was simple. Keep your balance. Keep your dignity. And for the love of the throne, don't fall over. If you've ever felt awkward deciding how close to stand to someone in an elevator, imagine that discomfort multiplied by 1,000 with your social survival, political relevance, and possibly your head on the line. Welcome to the world of royal personal space, a territory so sacred, so mysterious, and so dangerously easy to misjudge that entire generations of courtiers spent their lives calculating exactly how far to stand from their monarch without triggering suspicion, insult, or a swift career-ending glare. Stand too close and you're disrespectful. Stand too far and you're suspicious. Stand just right. Congratulations. You've passed Royal Goldilocks protocol. In royal courts, the monarch's personal space was not measured in inches or centimetres, but in status, privilege, and centuries-old superstition. This invisible bubble varied wildly from place to place, transforming what should have been a simple spatial awareness issue into a complicated choreography that kept everyone on edge and several steps away. Let's begin with the French court, a place where proximity to the monarch was more valuable than gold, land, or even a good wig. Versailles was essentially a series of concentric circles of privilege. The closer you physically stood to Louis XIV, the more important you were. Distance was not just spatial, it was social ranking carved into marble. Standing within a few feet of the king was considered a privilege that was granted, not assumed. Those who had the honour of approaching the king were said to be in favour, while those who lingered at the edges of the room were essentially atmospheric decoration with noble titles. But here's the catch. Getting too close without permission was the social equivalent of hurling yourself onto a bonfire. The king's body was sacred. His aura was sacred. His morning routine was sacred. Even his slippers were sacred. You could not simply wander into his space unless invited, and even then you had to glide like you were made of silk and prayer. Versailles functioned like an etiquette minefield. One misplaced footstep, and suddenly you were demoted from respected noble to the idiot who nearly brushed the king's sleeve. Spain took things even further. Perhaps out of religious fervour, perhaps out of paranoia, or perhaps because Spanish monarchs enjoyed watching courtiers sweat under the pressure of proximity laws. In the Spanish Habsburg court, the king's presence was treated with reverence so intense it bordered on mystical. Courtiers often kept a respectful distance not only out of etiquette, but because approaching the monarch was believed to disrupt the gravity of royal authority. Even nobles with high rank approached slowly, carefully, and usually after several rounds of ceremonial announcements, as if the king were a temperamental dragon who needed regular assurance that the visito was not there to steal his crown or his afternoon nap. At the Chinese imperial court, proximity was an entirely different universe, structured, symbolic, and highly ritualized. The emperor was the son of heaven, and no one, absolutely no one, stepped within his space without strict protocol guiding every step like a cosmic GPS. The Forbidden City itself was built to enforce distance. Hallways lengthened, courtyards widened, gates echoed with hollow grandeur specifically to remind everyone. The emperor does not come to you. You approach him solely, reverently, and probably sweating. Even high-ranking officials stood several meters away unless ordered forward. The emperor's personal space was not just an invisible bubble, it was an entire architectural philosophy designed to keep mere mortals suitably intimidated. But regardless of the kingdom, one rule applied universally across royal courts. Your distance from the monarch revealed your destiny. Too close and you risked appearing arrogant, presumptuous, or treasonously familiar. Too far, and people assumed you had fallen out of favour, were plotting something terrible, or had recently offended a member of the monarch's household staff, a crime nearly as serious as treason. It was a balancing act that made even experienced courtiers feel like they were walking a tightrope suspended above a pit of gossiping ladies-in-waiting. Proximity rules also applied while moving. Walking beside the monarch, only allowed if the monarch granted permission, and even then you walked exactly half a pace behind, as if you were honouring both the ruler and the local tradition of monarch-centred choreography. Sitting near the monarch, another privilege reserved for the elite few. Some courts even designated sitting distances, and if you sat too close during a ceremony, people assumed you were either horribly misinformed or shockingly bold. Either way, congratulations. You've given the rumour mill enough material for a week. Even moments of accidental proximity carried consequences. Approach the monarch from the wrong angle, and suddenly the royal guard viewed you as someone who might be plotting regicide. Trip forward unexpectedly, and someone might assume you were lunging. Take one step backward at the wrong time, and you risked bumping into another noble, which was the fastest way to ignite a silent feud lasting 3 generations. And then there were the truly unlucky courtiers, those who misjudged the distance so badly that they wandered too close, prompting the monarch to take one imperceptible step back. This microscopic retreat was a royal verdict. Everyone noticed. The court buzzed. The victim's career dimmed by 2 decades in a single motion. They may as well have announced, "I have made a catastrophic error and now shall fade quietly into political obscurity." But perhaps the most fascinating part of royal proximity etiquette was how it exposed ambition. People constantly measured each other. How close did they stand? How long were they allowed to remain? Did the monarch lean in? Did he step away? Was the Queen's expression fond familiarity or silent panic? Every inch mattered. In a world ruled by distance, the greatest skill was mastering the perfect approach, a slow, respectful glide that neither shocked the monarch nor suggested fear. A courtier who perfected this gained admiration. A courtier who botched it gained a new personal enemy, gravity. And so, in the royal court, personal space wasn't a boundary, it was a battlefield. If you have ever instinctively reached out to steady someone who tripped, adjust a collar, or brush lint off a friend's shoulder, congratulations. You've already broken half the royal etiquette rules of the past 1,000 years. In royal courts, touching the monarch was not a casual action. It was a rare cosmic event, like a solar eclipse or a polite meeting between in-laws. The rule was simple: don't. And if you thought don't meant avoid unless necessary, no. It meant do not breathe in a way that suggests the idea of touch. Touching the king or queen was treated with the seriousness of an international crisis. Monarchs were not merely people, they were symbols, embodiments of divine will, national identity, and, depending on the century, the unfortunate person expected to hold still while everyone else panicked about protocol. Their bodies were considered sacred, fragile, powerful, untouchable, and occasionally covered in jewels heavy enough to knock someone unconscious. Let's start with the absolute basics. You did not initiate touch. Ever. Touching the monarch without permission was like hitting a giant red button marked "Do not press unless you enjoy exile." A courtesy tap. Forbidden. A gentle hand on the arm. Treason adjacent. A handshake. Only if the monarch extended their hand first, and even then, you were expected to touch them as lightly as if they were made of glass dipped in irritation. Why such caution? For one, monarchs represented divine authority, and many believed their bodies were too sacred to be handled by regular mortals, especially sweaty-palmed courtiers who hadn't fully mastered the art of not trembling. But there was also a more practical issue: assassination paranoia. Monarchs were magnets for conspiracies' daggers, and the occasional cousin hoping to accidentally inherit the throne. Allowing people to touch them freely was asking for trouble. In England, the rule "don't touch the sovereign" became so ingrained that it practically entered the national DNA. Even centuries later, when modern guests shook Queen Elizabeth II's hand, they did so with the visible fear of someone defusing a bomb. The monarch might allow a touch, but only they could decide when, how, and to what extent, which is very similar to how cats govern petting. France, however, added layers of drama to the concept. At Versailles, touching Louis XIV was unthinkable, unless you were helping him during the daily dressing ritual, a shockingly intimate event that still required choreographed precision. Even the people authorized to assist the king had to move with the solemn reverence of priests handling holy relics. One valet described the honor as a blessing wrapped in terror. And then there was Spain, home to a court so formal that touching the monarch was nearly unthinkable in any circumstance. Habsburg kings were treated with such reverence that you could be punished for brushing against their garments, as if their clothing had diplomatic immunity. Even during emergencies, everyone hesitated. There is a recorded case of a Spanish noble who fainted near the king, began falling toward him, and several courtiers dove forward to intercept the noble mid-air so he wouldn't make accidental royal contact. The mission succeeded. The noble survived. The king remained untouched. It was considered a diplomatic triumph. Meanwhile, in China's imperial court, the taboo was even stronger. Touching the emperor was reserved for rare ceremonial moments performed by specific, highly trained attendants. Anyone else approaching the emperor was with unapproved hands risked immediate punishment, and not the gentle kind involving stern lectures. Imperial guards were trained to respond with immediate force, which is why courtiers approached the emperor like frightened penguins greeting a very moody volcano. But there was one exception to the rule, an exception that terrified courtiers in every culture. The monarch could touch you. When the monarch initiated contact, it was usually symbolic. A tap with a sword meant knighthood. A touch on the shoulder might indicate favour. A pat on the head during childhood ceremonies showed royal affection, though more than one child was so overwhelmed by the honour that they burst into tears, fainted, or both. But despite these ceremonial touches, most people reacted with stunned horror, because if the monarch initiated touch, it meant three things. Everyone was watching. This moment would be talked about for weeks. You now had to respond in a way that did not make you look like a startled goat. The worst-case scenario, however, was accidental touch, a category of disaster so feared that entire careers evaporated in seconds because of it. One famously unlucky courtier in England slipped on a polished floor and reached forward instinctively to steady himself, planting his hand directly on the Queen's arm. Witnesses described the moment as a silence so heavy it could have crushed a cathedral. The Queen, to her credit, did not faint, scream, or execute him on the spot. She simply stepped back. Everyone else did the emotional collapsing through her. The poor man was sent away soon after, supposedly to oversee some distant estate that likely didn't exist before the incident. Another case unfolded in the Ottoman court when a foreign ambassador, unused to local protocol, greeted the Sultan with a warm, friendly pat on the shoulder. The room froze, time froze, the ambassador's career froze. The Sultan stared at him for a full 10 seconds, the kind of stare that could turn granite into dust. Miraculously, the ambassador survived, mostly because the Sultan found the gesture amusing, though the diplomatic community spent months recovering from collective second-hand panic. Touching wasn't just physical, it was political. To touch a monarch without permission implied familiarity, equality, or dominion, all of which were dangerous ideas in societies built on hierarchy. It threatened the balance of the court, the authority of the throne, and the comfort of guards who did not wish to explain to their commander why they allowed an accidental shoulder tap. So in the end, the rule remained beautifully simple. Do not touch the monarch unless you're invited. And even then, touch like your fingers are made of humility, and your soul is prepared for judgment. If you have ever sat at a fancy dinner and panicked over which fork to use, rest assured that was nothing. Royal courts perfected dining etiquette to such absurd heights that a single misplaced utensil could end alliances, ignite scandals, or doom you to a lifetime of sitting at the far corner of the banquet hall, also known as exile with better food. In these glittering halls, dinner wasn't simply a meal. It was a performance, a diplomatic spectacle, and occasionally a choreographed battle against soup, etiquette, and one's own trembling hands. Court dining was governed by rules so elaborate that entire manuals were written, just to explain how not to embarrass yourself in front of the monarch. These were not slim, sensible pamphlets. These were multi-volume sagas thicker than holy scriptures, featuring helpful diagrams, coded instructions, and stern warnings such as never tilt your spoon above 40 degrees unless commanded by a higher-ranking duke. People trained for months just to survive a single banquet, and even then, failure lurked behind every piece of cutlery. Let's begin with seating arrangements, because where you sat was as politically charged as where nobles stood at court ceremonies. The closer your chair was to the monarch, the more prestigious your life was, and the more delicate your every action became. Sitting near the monarch meant you were both honoured and constantly monitored. You had to maintain the posture of a marble statue while eating food prepared with the subtle complexity of edible architecture. You couldn't slump, you couldn't wiggle, you couldn't under any circumstances show signs of being human. And further down the table, things grew slightly more relaxed, but not enough that anyone enjoyed themselves. Even the lowest-ranked noble had to follow strict codes. Hands visible, elbows in, no leaning, no reaching, no sighing, no dropping utensils, no appearing hungry, and absolutely no looking like you were enjoying the meal too much. A royal banquet trained people to master the art of eating food as if it had personally offended them. Now, let's talk utensils, because nothing reveals the madness of royal etiquette more clearly than the fork, the spoon, and the knife that occasionally doubled as a weapon of judgment. In many courts, utensils were assigned specific roles. There was a fish fork, a fruit fork, a pastry fork, a ceremonial fork used only when eating in the presence of a visiting dignitary, and a mysterious fork employed when the main dish was something that required delicate hesitation. If you picked up the wrong fork, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a message, a diplomatic signal, a coded gesture implying disrespect, ignorance, or carnivorous tendencies unbecoming of your station. Spoons had their own rules. In France, one did not slurp. The very idea of a noble making noise while consuming soup was treated like a national threat. The correct method was to tilt the spoon away from oneself, lift carefully without dripping, and consume the soup silently, as if inhaling flavour from the air. England, however, tolerated slight spoon sounds, but not too many. A single polite tap was acceptable. A second suggested excitement. A third sent a message to the table that you had lost control of your life. Knife etiquette was equally dramatic. In some courts, you held the knife like a tool of refinement. In others, you held it like a delicate pen. And in a few, you were discouraged from touching the knife at all because someone centuries earlier had stabbed a roast too aggressively, and it was declared unseemly to puncture meat with enthusiasm. But beyond utensils lay the unspoken minefield of drinking etiquette, a ritual so coded and so treacherous that many courtiers drank less out of thirst and more out of terror. Raising your goblet too high suggested arrogance. Raising it too low suggested insolence. Drinking before the monarch, forbidden. Drinking immediately after the monarch, required. Drinking too often, suspicious. Drinking not enough, also suspicious. There were even courts where the monarch's cup was so symbolically powerful that if they merely touched their goblet, everyone froze like startled deer, waiting to see whether they should follow suit. Some monarchs preferred wine, others preferred water, and one unfortunate king of Scandinavia reportedly preferred both, confusing the entire table and leading to a full-scale etiquette crisis recorded in several diplomatic reports. Then there was chewing. If you think chewing is a natural, unremarkable act, think again. Royal courts turned it into a political statement. French monarchs despised loud chewing and banned it entirely. Anyone caught making noise while eating risked public humiliation or, worse, being called uncultured. Meanwhile, in certain Eastern European courts, enthusiastic chewing was considered a compliment to the chef. The louder the chew, the greater the honour, a rule that caused horrifying cultural misunderstandings whenever foreign visitors were involved. The Ottomans believed in elegant silence during meals, while the Russian court tolerated hearty bites as long as they were performed with dignity. One emperor even remarked, "Let the nobles eat as boldly as they fight," which explains why banquets there often sounded like someone rhythmically tackling a loaf of bread. Food temperature also mattered. Some monarchs hated hot dishes and demanded everything warm. Others insisted on scalding meals that could burn the mouth, because if the king could tolerate heat, so should you. Eating too quickly meant greed. Too slowly meant insult. Finishing your plate suggested you were not accustomed to abundance. Leaving food behind suggested you hated the chef. The balance was impossible, which is exactly why etiquette instructors thrived. And yes, instructors existed specifically to teach nobles how to chew discreetly, swallow silently, and navigate cutlery like battlefield generals. They corrected posture, adjusted grip, and taught polite expressions such as delighted neutrality and serene appreciation, which were considered appropriate reactions to even the blandest dish. A courtier caught savouring food too enthusiastically could be judged as lacking restraint, proof that even pleasure was regulated. In the end, royal table manners weren't just etiquette. They were code. They were diplomacy disguised as dinner. They were the throne's subtle reminder that even at the dinner table, power ruled every bite. If you think talking to your boss is intimidating, Try talking to someone who could, with a single raised eyebrow, decide whether you kept your home, your title, or your head. Speaking to royalty was not a conversation. It was a high-stakes performance, a delicate linguistic dance where one wrong word could ignite scandal, suspicion, or a lifetime appointment managing sheep in the distant countryside. In the royal court, speech wasn't communication, it was survival. Let's start with the most important rule. You did not speak first. Ever. Not unless spoken to, gestured at, nodded towards, summoned by name, or granted a subtle flick of the royal wrist that essentially said, "Fine, you may produce noise." Opening your mouth prematurely could be interpreted as arrogance, overfamiliarity, or, worst of all, enthusiasm. Courts despised enthusiasm. Enthusiasm led to mistakes. And mistakes led to paperwork, and monarchs hated paperwork almost as much as incompetence. So you waited, silent, motionless, ideally blending into the background like decorative furniture. The monarch controlled the tempo of every interaction. If the king or queen felt talkative, they might open with a gentle question. If they weren't in the mood, your allotted communication might consist of a single nod and a silent prayer that you didn't somehow offend them by existing too loudly. Once the monarch began speaking, your challenge was to respond appropriately. Not truthfully, not personally, but appropriately. The fine art of pretending your opinion didn't exist was one of the most essential skills of court life. If the monarch said, "It is a fine morning," you agreed, even if it was raining knives. If the monarch complained the soup was cold, you nodded sympathetically, even if steam was rising off it like a volcanic crater. Your personal thoughts, preferences, or common sense were irrelevant. The only correct reaction was the one that reinforced the monarch's worldview. But even when allowed to speak, you couldn't say just anything. Royal courts maintained lengthy lists of banned topics, verbal landmines that courtiers avoided like the plague, sometimes literally. These forbidden subjects varied by culture and monarch, but common examples included taxes. Not because monarchs disliked the concept, but because discussing them reminded everyone who actually paid them. Personal illnesses. Monarchs did not wish to hear about your gout. Their own gout? Yes. Yours? Absolutely not. Marriage gossip, especially dangerous in courts where royal marriages resembled political hostage situations. Recent executions considered impolite dinner conversation even when half the guests were involved. The weather, surprisingly controversial since disagreeing about the temperature was seen as contradicting the monarch. And then there were the forbidden words, phrases so hazardous that nobles practiced avoiding them the way acrobats practiced landing safely. Words like problem, mistake, or decline were political dynamite. Instead of saying something was bad, you might call it unfavourable. Instead of calling an idea stupid, you'd describe it as ambitious. Instead of saying, "Your Majesty, this plan will fail catastrophically," you'd politely offer, "Perhaps we might consider alternative strategies." No one lied at court. They simply rearranged the truth until it became unrecognisable. Length was another battlefield. Speak too long and you were wasting the monarch's precious time. Speak too briefly and you seemed evasive. Speak with confidence and you risked sounding assertive. Speak too softly and you risk sounding guilty. The ideal royal response was exactly long enough to convey respect, but short enough that no one suspected you of having thoughts. Some monarchs preferred lengthy, poetic responses. Others hated unnecessary words and expected sentences trimmed down like bonsai trees. One 17th century French duke reportedly practiced speaking in perfectly timed increments so he wouldn't accidentally ramble and become the subject of Versailles gossip hour, which operated with the speed and efficiency of a modern social media algorithm. Tone mattered even more. You had to sound calm, deferential, intelligent but not too intelligent, loyal but not desperate, and obedient without appearing robotic. This was a narrow emotional hallway that most people crashed into at least twice a week. And then there was silence, the most terrifying tool in the monarch's arsenal. If you said something questionable, awkward, or slightly nonsensical, the monarch might respond with a long, heavy silence. a suddenness that pressed down on the room like a cathedral's stone dome, a silence that forced you to replay your sentence over and over in your head, wondering if you had accidentally insulted the throne, the nation, or the royal dog. Even worse was the polite silence, the kind that suggested the monarch understood you but did not approve. This could end careers. People resigned over polite silence. People fled countries over polite silence. People wrote memoirs about polite silence that scholars now study as cautionary tales. In some courts, silence wasn't just the absence of speech, or it was its own language. If the monarch paused before answering, it might mean they were displeased. If they paused after answering, it might mean they were waiting for you to interpret their unspoken subtext. Most courtiers developed a sixth sense for royal silence, though that sixth sense occasionally malfunctioned, leading to disastrous misinterpretations like monarch, courtier, absolutely, your majesty, I shall burn it all immediately. Monarch, horrified, blinking. Conversation wasn't just risky, it was strategic. Courtiers used speech to display loyalty, hint at alliances, or subtly sabotage rivals. A well-timed compliment could shift political tides. A clumsy remark could destroy a marriage pact. Words were weapons, and everyone wielded them with the caution of surgeons handling scalpels. Even the monarchs weren't free of social pressure. They too had to navigate the expectations of courtly dialogue. A king who spoke too bluntly risked looking crude. A queen who spoke too softly risked seeming weak. A monarch who asked the wrong question risked sparking rumours that consumed the palace. The throne was powerful, but even it was bound by etiquette. In the end, speaking to royalty required skill, calculation, and nerves of steel. It demanded that you speak precisely, cautiously, deferentially, and often without revealing anything of yourself. It was a test of respect, intelligence, timing, and emotional control, and the greatest challenge of all, making sure the monarch believed you had nothing on your mind except them. If you've ever stared at your closet and thought, I have nothing to wear, congratulations. You share a spiritual bond with centuries worth of nobles who faced the same crisis, except their dilemma came with the added risk of fines, banishment, or a very polite execution. In royal courts, clothing wasn't fashions, it was law, weaponry, economic warfare, and a daily reminder that your entire social identity could be judged by the shade of your sleeves. Welcome to the world of sumptuary rules, laws designed to control who could wear what, when they could wear it, and how dazzling they were allowed to look while standing within visual range of the monarch. This point wasn't style, it was hierarchy. If a king or queen wanted to shine brightest in the room, everyone else was legally required to dim themselves like obedient human nightlights. These laws appeared across Europe and Asia and the Middle East, and although the specifics differed, the message was universal. Don't you dare look expensive unless you've earned it, inherited it, or bribed enough officials to pretend you've earned it. Let's begin with the most infamous culprit, fabric restrictions. Not all textiles were created equal. Silk, fine, but only if you were high-ranking, otherwise you were accused of pretending to be someone. Velvet, allowed, but only certain types. Embroidered brocade, restricted to nobles. Cloth of gold, reserved exclusively for royalty, religious officials, and the occasional royal pet dressed for festivals. The wrong fabric could send you straight into trouble. Imagine a tailor presenting you with a gorgeous outfit only to whisper, "Wear this, and you will be personally escorted out of the kingdom." Excellent craftsmanship. Terrible survival strategy. Wool and linen were safe choices for common people. Practical, ordinary, and firmly within the "you may wear this without being arrested" category. But at court, even the type of wool mattered. Finer weaves signalled wealth. Coarser ones suggested humility. Extra soft imported wool. Forbidden unless you held a title longer than your leg. Nobles spent fortunes acquiring legal fabrics while quietly envying peasants who could wear whatever they wanted without risking exile. Then came dangerous colour choices, which were the real minefield. Colours had meaning, enormous meanings, and the court took them extremely seriously. Wear the wrong colour at the wrong time, and suddenly you weren't just making a fashion mistake, you were making a political statement. The worst offender of all? Purple, the colour that launched 1,000 executions. Across many cultures, purple was the colour of supreme authority, rare, costly and tightly controlled. In ancient Rome, only the emperor was allowed to wear certain shades of imperial purple, and anyone caught imitating that colour could be punished severely. Even the dye itself was expensive, made from crushed sea snails, so rare that wearing purple was basically draping yourself in the tears of an ecosystem. Later European courts inherited purple's prestige. If you wore it without permission, guards might politely escort you out, in the way people politely escort raccoons out of bakeries. Other forbidden colours varied by region. In China, bright yellow veilleux was imperial territory. If you dared to show up wearing a yellow robe, congratulations, you'd committed fashion treason. In England, certain royal blues were restricted. In France, scarlet and gold combinations were so tied to royalty that imitating them was considered aesthetic encroachment, which is a poetic way of saying, "What were you thinking?" Court attendees spent hours deciding not what looked good, but what wouldn't get them arrested by the colour police. And then there was jewellery, which had its own labyrinth of restrictions. Diamonds, yes, but sizes mattered. Rubies, allowed, unless the monarch had declared rubies symbolic of the crown's splendour, in which case you better enjoy sapphires. Pearls were delicate, feminine and politically safe, until they weren't. Some monarchs claimed exclusive rights to pearl-studded crowns and gowns, meaning if you showed up wearing too many pearls, you were essentially staging a silent coup. Not ideal. Accessories became coded messages. Shoes with gold thread, only for elite nobles. Feathers in hats, allowed unless the feather was too tall, which signalled arrogance, rebellion, or an attempt to look physically above your station. Fans, perfectly acceptable, but only if made from approved materials. If your fan had illegal lace imported from France, congratulations. You'd brought international smuggling to the royal ballroom. The financial pressure of these rules was enormous. Nobles spent fortunes trying to appear wealthy enough to belong, but not so wealthy that they upstaged the monarch. Imagine constantly needing to dress like a chandelier, but never brighter than the chandelier above you. Many families went broke keeping up with court fashion, because wearing last year's style was dangerous. It implied stagnation. It implied weakness. It implied you weren't rich enough to buy new clothes, which made people wonder what else you were failing at. And failure was contagious. Courtiers knew that the wrong outfit could trigger whispers. Whispers could trigger rumours. Rumours could trigger suspicion. Suspicion could lead to a conversation with the monarch's advisors, which was the medieval equivalent of being called into the principal's office while juggling knives. The most tragic cases were those who mistook fashion bravery for fashion permission. One noblewoman in 16th century France wore a gown with gold thread embroidery, supposedly reserved for members of the royal family. The Queen did not publicly rebuke her. She simply stared at the dress long enough for the entire court to notice. The noblewoman fainted from humiliation before dinner was served. The dress disappeared forever. But perhaps the true absurdity was how clothing became a tool of psychological warfare. Monarchs manipulated dress codes to control their courtiers' wallets, appearances, and reputations. One king insisted that nobles wear outfits of a particular fabric that was outrageously expensive, conveniently manufactured by the king's own textile factories. Every banquet became a royal-sponsored bankruptcy ritual. Despite all the chaos, one rule reigned supreme. Only the monarch set the aesthetic. Everyone else obeyed it. And heaven help the soul who sparkled too brightly. Working as a royal servant was not a job. It was a supernatural ability. In a world where nobles strutted around like decorative peacocks and monarchs ruled with the confidence of people who had never once carried their own plate, servants existed in a parallel universe governed by one foundational commandment. You may exist, but please reconsider it. Servants were essential, omnipresent, highly trained, and somehow required to behave as if they were made of fog. To understand their etiquette, picture the palace as a grand theatrical performance. Nobles played the starring roles, The monarch was the sun everyone revolved around, and servants were the stagehands silently sprinting behind the scenes, ensuring the entire production didn't collapse like a flan on a hot day. Their genius lay not in what they did, which was everything, but in the fact that they did it without drawing breath, attention, or, heaven forbid, opinions. The first rule was simple: move silently. A servant's footsteps were not allowed to sound human. They needed to glide, float, ruffed, anything but step. Many servants practiced walking in soft-soled shoes that cushioned each footfall like tiny cloud. Others trained to roll their weight across their feet so smoothly that even polished marble floors could not expose their existence. A loudly walking servant was considered disruptive. A servant who made no noise at all was considered excellent, and a servant who startled nobles by appearing suddenly behind them was considered perfect, but silence alone was not enough. Servants had to master the art of moving quickly while pretending to be stationary. Imagine you're carrying 3 trays, 4 goblets, a fan, a platter of roast meat, and the crushing weight of 100 etiquette expectations, all while racing across a crowded hall. Now imagine you must perform this feat while maintaining the serenity of someone slowly contemplating poetry in a garden. If a noble glanced in their direction, they froze. If a monarch entered the room, they lowered their heads. If 2 nobles were speaking, servants avoided passing between them, even if it meant detouring around half the palace. Palaces developed entire back corridor systems so servants could appear magically without ever walking through the spaces where nobles actually lived. In many courts, if you ever noticed a servant, that servant risked reprimand. The highest compliment they could receive was that no one remembered if they were there at all. Another key survival rule: avoid eye contact at all costs. Eye contact implied equality, and equality implied delusion. Servants kept their gaze lowered to the floor, the tray, or the invisible midpoint in front of them known as the safe stare. They did not look directly at nobles, they did not look indirectly at nobles, they did not look near nobles. The safest eyes were eyes firmly fixed on the nearest tile. Some nobles enjoyed testing this rule by staring at servants until they trembled. Servants, following protocol, simply stared harder at the floor, hoping their knees didn't wobble. Now, let's address the truly impossible requirement: carrying trays without breathing. Did etiquette manuals explicitly say don't breathe while serving? Not exactly, but they may as well have. Proper servant behaviour involved quietness so extreme that even inhaling too loudly was considered rude. Servants were expected to perform balancing acts, enormous platters, fragile porcelain, towers of dishes, without ever huffing, puffing, or revealing symptoms of physical strain. This pressure led to the rise of what we might call early athletic servants. These were individuals who spent years training for endurance, posture, and the ability to stand absolutely still while holding objects heavier than their annual salary. Some could balance trays with a single hand for hours. Others mastered the technique of bending gracefully while holding a full tea service without spilling a drop. One famous servant at the Prussian court reportedly carried a silver platter so heavy it would have crushed an ordinary man, but he lifted it with the expression of someone casually holding a feather. Servant etiquette extended beyond movement and posture into the realm of sound discipline. Servants could not cough. Clearing their throat was forbidden. Sneezing was a disaster. One servant in the French court sneezed so unexpectedly during a quiet morning meeting that the entire room froze. The king reportedly stared at him for 10 seconds, during which the servant reconsidered every life choice that brought him to this sneeze-dominated moment. He wasn't executed, but he was transferred to an estate so distant that no one ever saw him again. Then came conversational etiquette, or more accurately, the absence of conversation. Servants did not speak unless spoken to, and even then, they spoke in short, soft sentences. They never volunteered information. They never made jokes. They never commented on noble behaviour, even when nobles set themselves on fire with enthusiasm during festivals. Their voices were tools, not expressions, and yet servants were the palace's unofficial intelligence network. They observed everything while pretending to observe nothing. They heard everything while pretending to hear nothing. Every whispered argument, every secret romance, every wardrobe malfunction, servants saw it all, stored it away, and said not a word. A servant with loose lips could destroy a kingdom. A servant with sealed lips could save one. The irony was that servants were more competent than half the nobles they served. They ran the palace like a well-oiled machine, preparing rooms, dressing monarchs, organising events, tending fires, managing kitchens, delivering news, handling crises, and occasionally preventing nobles from accidentally poisoning themselves with too much enthusiasm for exotic dishes. And they did all of this with a level of discretion that made spies seem chatty. Yet despite their essential role, royal philosophy towards servants remained unchanged. Be fast, be perfect, be silent, be invisible, ideally in that order. And so, throughout history, servants lived in this paradox, indispensable, unnoticed, and expected to perform miracles without leaving a footprint behind. They were the royal court's quiet guardians, working at a speed no one was allowed to acknowledge. If you've ever stressed about what to bring to a birthday party, wedding, or offer Secret Santa, take comfort. At least none of those situations risked accidentally insulting a monarch and triggering diplomatic collapse. In the royal court, choosing a gift wasn't polite generosity. It was a geopolitical tightrope walk. Every object carried meaning, every detail sent a message, and the wrong message could turn a simple present into a national emergency. Congratulations, you brought the wrong gift. Hope your family enjoys exile. That, in essence, was the unspoken slogan of royal gift-giving. Gift-giving at court wasn't optional. It was expected, demanded even, as proof of loyalty, respect, allegiance, and occasionally submission. Birthdays, weddings, coronations, christenings, treaty signings, seasonal festivals, royal victories, royal defeats, royal breakfasts, every event needed a gift. And the monarch expected each one to be thoughtful, extravagant, and politically flattering. So how did courtiers navigate this minefield? They didn't. They panicked. They consulted advisors, diplomats, clerks, theologians, personal astrologers, and occasionally the stars themselves, in hopes that the heavens might whisper, "Give pearls." The first major rule: never give something equal to or greater than the monarch's own possessions. The throne had to remain visually, materially, and symbolically superior. If you presented a gift that looked too expensive, the monarch might accuse you of flaunting your wealth, hinting at pretensions of equality, or, worst of all, subtly implying that the royal treasury was slipping. Kings and queens were many things, but self-deprecating was not one of them. So nobles crafted gifts that were luxurious but strategically inferior. Gold, acceptable, but less gold than whatever the monarch already owned. Jewels, good, but never larger than the ones on the crown. Silks, fine, unless they were imported from a region the monarch disliked, a diplomatic faux pas equivalent to sending a fruit basket filled with tax receipts. But the opposite mistake, giving something too simple, was equally disastrous. A gift that was too plain suggested disrespect, laziness, financial weakness, or a shocking lack of imagination. One courtier at the Spanish court once brought a modest silver goblet to a celebration. The king accepted it with polite silence, which everyone knew was royal code for "I am deeply offended, but too civilized to scream while holding a wine cup." The courtier relocated to a distant province shortly thereafter. Materials weren't the only trap. Symbolism played a massive role. Every culture assigned meaning to objects, and failing to understand these meanings was dangerous. In China, certain numbers were lucky, others unlucky. A gift with the wrong number of items risked sending a message like, "May your dynasty end soon." In Persia, specific flowers held political significance. Give the wrong flower and you were essentially saying "best wishes, also, I support your rival." In medieval Europe, clocks or timepieces were forbidden gifts because they implied the monarch's time on the throne was running out. Nothing says long live the king like handing him a countdown. Then there were forbidden gifts, a category so long that courtiers kept lists, secret ones naturally. Forbidden gifts included weapons, implied threat, certain animals, implied insult, mirrors, implied vanity, shoes, implied that the monarch should go somewhere else, books, implied that the monarch needed educating, deadly, blankets, implied weakness, illness, or a cold heart. Monarchs sometimes added personal dislikes to the forbidden list. One Austrian emperor banned red items after a childhood trauma involving a spinning wheel. Another monarch forbade feathered fans because they reminded him of a parrot that once bit him. The challenge for courtiers was not only remembering these arbitrary rules, but also guessing which ones the monarch might suddenly invent mid-banquet. The greatest danger came from politically explosive gifts, objects that unintentionally resembled treason, a gift from a region the monarch had recently conquered. Suspicious, a gift depicting a lion when the royal symbol was a dragon. Treasonous, a gift showing two clasped hands. Friendship? No. Plotting. One particularly disastrous incident took place in 16th century France, where a foreign envoy brought a beautifully woven tapestry depicting a rising sun. Unfortunately, the king's emblem was the sun, and he interpreted the rising sun motif as implying that a new sun was emerging to replace him. The envoy spent the next decade in diplomatic purgatory, writing apologetic letters that historians now classify under the genre panicked grovelling. Another famous mishap occurred in Japan, when a European noble gifted a pair of elaborate leather boots to a daimyo. Although the boots were expensive, the gesture insulted the recipient, who interpreted them as a suggestion that he should walk away, or worse, escape. The noble was not harmed, but his departure from the court was expedited with the gentle force of several samurai, who helped him understand the symbolism. Even safer gifts, jewels, rare animals, artworks, carried risk. A tiger gifted to an Indian ruler symbolized power. A tiger gifted to a European monarch symbolized, "I hope this eats you." A portrait of the monarch had to flatter but not distort, glorify but not parody. Artists walked a thin line between flattery and accidental caricature, and the phrase "he painted my nose too round" once sparked an entire diplomatic standoff. Despite these dangers, gift-giving could elevate careers. If you managed to find the perfect balance, respectful, meaningful, flattering, subtly inferior to royal possessions yet undeniably impressive, the monarch rewarded you with titles, land, influence, or at the very least, the absence of punishment. In royal terms, this counted as affection, but in the end, the pressure remained the same. Your gift wasn't just a present. It was a statement of who you were, who you supported, and whether you understood the emotional weather patterns of the throne. Choose wisely and you rose. Choose poorly and you packed your bags. If you think modern dinner parties get awkward when someone accidentally takes the host's favourite seat, welcome to the royal court, where sitting down was a full-contact sport, hierarchy was measured in inches, and one misplaced chair could ignite enough scandal to keep the gossip networks vibrating for months. Seating wasn't convenience. It wasn't comfort. It was political architecture, a battlefield of cushions, stools, benches and thrones, where careers rose and fell depending on where your backside landed. In the royal court, chairs were not furniture, they were symbols, and symbols had consequences. Let's start with the obvious centerpiece. The throne, the grandest and most terrifying chair ever invented. This was not merely a seat, it was the visible embodiment of power, elevated, embellished, and positioned so that every courtier, foreign diplomat and nervous relative had to look up at the monarch. Thrones sat on platforms, steps, dais structures, or stages specifically designed to remind everyone, you're below this person in every imaginable way. But thrones had rules. Only the monarch sat on the throne. Anyone else who touched, approached, or even stared too long at it risked accusations ranging from bad manners to attempted usurpation. In some cultures, Even cleaning the throne required religious purification, because one did not casually polish the seat of divine authority. Next in the hierarchy came the privilege of chairs. Ordinary nobles did not automatically receive the right to sit. In many courts, sitting was itself a form of political recognition. If the monarch allowed you to sit, even on something wobbly, backless, and shaped like a regret, you were important. If they did not allow you to sit, you stood, and stood, and stood, possibly for hours, possibly for entire ceremonies, possibly until you fainted, which was considered mildly embarrassing and entirely your fault. Different courts had different philosophies on this. The French court elevated chair hierarchy to artistic levels. They had fauteuils, armchairs, reserved for the highest-ranking nobles. Chaises, chairs without arms, allowed for certain privileged ladies. Tabourets, stools, semi-honourable seats granted to nobles of medium importance, especially women close to the queen. The stool privilege was so coveted that aristocratic families boasted about it in marriage negotiations. A bride's dowry might include jewels, money, and, most importantly, the right to perch her noble butt on an official stool during royal gatherings. Meanwhile, in the Spanish court, the rules were even stricter. Chairs were rare privileges reserved for a microscopic elite. Everyone else remained standing like elegant statues with circulation problems. Even high-ranking foreign ambassadors often found themselves on their feet, struggling to maintain dignity while their legs slowly abandoned them. Sitting without explicit permission was unthinkable. Rumours circulated of nobles who dared to lean against walls and were punished for horizontal disrespect. Then there was the Ottoman court, where footstool etiquette became a category all its own. The Sultan's footstool was sacred, symbolic, and never to be touched by anyone without specific duty. Ottoman footstools represented divine authority, military dominance, and spiritual legitimacy. Accidentally nudging the Sultan's footstool with your robe? Congratulations, you just caused a minor international panic. In one recorded incident, a visiting dignitary brushed the edge of the Sultan's footstool while adjusting his coat. The room froze, the guards tensed. The dignitary went instantly pale, realizing he had violated a rule so important it might require immediate forgiveness or immediate burial. In Chinese imperial courts, seating reflected cosmic order. The emperor sat facing south, the direction of heaven's favour. Officials sat according to rank, seniority, and moral virtue, or at least the carefully staged version of moral virtue portrayed in court records. Sitting too close to the emperor implied arrogance. Sitting too far away suggested disgrace. Sitting in the wrong direction could symbolically misalign you with the heavens. One unlucky official reportedly sat one row too high during a ceremony and spent the rest of his life writing apologetic letters while guarding a remote border outpost. But the greatest dangers came from height differences, the silent killers of political careers. In many royal courts, your seat had to be lower than the monarch's, not equal, not close, not slightly shorter, but still elegant. Lower, significantly lower. Sitting even a few inches too high was interpreted as arrogance, disloyalty, or subtle rebellion. Even accidental height imbalances could cause diplomatic disasters. For example, in England, a foreign ambassador was once seated on a chair accidentally taller than King James I. King James stared at the chair. The ambassador stared at the chair. Courtiers stared at both of them. The entire room suddenly understood that gravity had become treasonous. The ambassador was promptly moved to a shorter chair. The damage, however, was done. Rumours spread that the ambassador had symbolically tried to dethrone the king one butt cheek at a time. In France, a noblewoman attending a ceremony brought her own cushion, a soft, plump, luxuriously embroidered cushion, unaware that it raised her several inches higher than etiquette allowed. When she sat, the entire row gasped. The Queen's expression froze into the kind of polite smile monarchs use when contemplating vengeance. The cushion disappeared that evening, and so did the noblewoman's invitations to future events. Even minor details mattered. How far back you sat, how close your knees were allowed to be to the monarch, whether your chair had arms, prestigious, or none, less prestigious, whether you sat while the monarch stood, forbidden, whether you stood while the monarch sat, usually fine, unless your posture implied boredom. Sitting was not passive. Sitting was political movement disguised as stillness. And in some courts, the punishment for breaking seating protocol was not exile, fines or demotion, it was social death. Your reputation evaporated, invitations dried up, gossip swirled. People eyed you with a mix of pity and mild delight. Failing seating etiquette was so embarrassing that nobles sometimes pretended to faint just to avoid explaining why they sat in the wrong place. At the end of the day, seating and arrangements weren't about chairs. They were about obedience. They were about hierarchy. They were about the throne reminding everyone exactly who was in charge, from the highest armchair to the lowest stool. And so in the royal court, one rule remained absolute. Sit carefully, sit correctly, and never, ever sit higher than the person who can ruin your entire life with a finger. When you imagine royal entertainment, glittering balls, soaring operas, elaborate ballets, theatrical performances that lasted longer than some monarchs' marriages, you probably picture elegance, culture, refinement. What you should picture is a room full of nobles silently having panic attacks about when to clap, how loudly to breathe, and whether their sneeze might accidentally spark a diplomatic incident. Court entertainment wasn't just fun. It was a labyrinth of rules, rituals, and subtle dangers where every courtier was expected to behave with the precision of a trained falcon and the emotional restraint of a marble statue. Let's start with the most stressful question of all. When were you allowed to clap? Clapping at court was not a spontaneous reaction, it was a choreographed gesture, carefully timed, socially permitted, and often signalled first by the monarch. If the king or queen enjoyed the performance, they might clap softly, a gentle cue that the rest of the room could follow. But if the monarch remained still, motionless, expressionless, congratulations, the entire court was now trapped in respectful silence, even if the performers were twisting themselves into artistic pretzels on stage and desperately hoping someone would acknowledge their existence. Different courts had different expectations. In France, applause began only after the monarch's hands moved first, no exceptions. In Spain, applause was viewed and considered unnecessary, unless the performance was extraordinary or the performer was royalty adjacent. In Russia, applause could be enthusiastic, but only if it didn't overshadow the monarch's own level of enthusiasm. If the Tsar clapped 3 times, you clap 3 times. 4, too many. 2, a dangerous underperformance. Perfect imitation was survival. But clapping was just one part of the minefield. There were rules for facial expressions too. Noble faces were expected to reflect polite appreciation, nothing more. Looking too delighted suggested lack of dignity. Looking too bored suggested disrespect. Looking confused implied low intellect. Looking too emotionally moved risked accusations of being dramatic. Even eye movement mattered. One should ideally gaze forward with calm attentiveness, as if the performance were a pleasant whisper, rather than the 7-hour opera marathon it usually was. Speaking of opera, it was one of the most rule-heavy events in the royal repertoire. Operas were long, emotional, and filled with opportunities for etiquette disasters. People fainted from boredom. People fainted from excitement. People fainted because fainting was fashionable in some centuries. But the worst sin of all? Sneezing. A sneeze during a royal opera was not a harmless bodily reflex. It was a sonic crime. It was a disruption of culture, a declaration of war against acoustics, and in at least 3 courts, most notoriously in Austria, Brandenburg, Prussia, and Naples, it was considered borderline treason. Why? Because opera was sacred. The monarch enjoyed perfection. Silence was the canvas on which music painted its soul. A sneeze shattered that silence like a musket blast. Imagine a soprano holding a high note for 15 seconds. The room breathless, and then someone in the ambassadorial row explodes with an "ah!" loud enough to derail diplomatic negotiations. Punishments varied. Sometimes the offender was quietly escorted out by attendants who looked suspiciously like bouncers. Sometimes they were glared at by every noble in the room until they melted into a puddle of shame. In one legendary incident in Vienna, a sneeze interrupted the emperor's favourite aria. Witnesses claimed that the emperor's head turned so slowly toward the culprit that the entire audience felt a chill run down their collective spine. The sneezer was relocated to a distant estate for health reasons, a polite phrase meaning, "Please sneeze very far away from His Majesty's opera time." Ballets had their own rules. Ballet etiquette was less about noise and more about stillness. Audience members were expected to remain perfectly poised, hands folded, posture straight, no shifting, no scratching, no adjusting jewellery. The dancers were the ones performing, not you. If you so much as fidgeted during a delicate pas de deux, you risked being interpreted as restless or uncultured. One duchess in the French court earned the lifelong nickname Madame Twitches because she adjusted her shawl twice during a royal ballet. Ceremonial performances, coronations, royal birthdays, state banquets were the most rigid of all. In these events, entertainment was not meant to be enjoyed but witnessed. You were not an audience member. You were a decorative audience accessory. Laughing forbidden, whispering forbidden, grimacing at a long-winded monologue, absolutely forbidden, smiling slightly at the wrong moment. Potentially insulting. Some monarchs imposed even stranger rules. A Chinese emperor once forbade anyone from looking directly at the entertainers during a specific palace ritual. Guests had to face slightly downward and enjoy the performance only from peripheral vision. A Mughal emperor demanded that performers be applauded only with soft taps of the fingertips on the knee. Anything louder was considered uncouth. In the Ottoman palace, musicians performed behind screens so their presence wouldn't distract from the Sultan. Clapping for them was deemed inappropriate unless the Sultan initiated it. Then there were moments when the monarch's mood determined everything. Performers prayed for a cheerful ruler. If the monarch laughed, the audience was allowed to laugh. If the monarch cried, the audience could weep respectfully. If the monarch yawned, no one else could, unless they wished to imply that royalty was somehow boring. A fatal implication. Foreign visitors had the hardest time. Many came from courts with totally different customs. Some clapped too early, some clapped too enthusiastically. One ambassador from a northern kingdom reportedly shouted, "Bravo!" during a solemn ceremony, causing an entire row of nobles to gasp so loudly it nearly counted as applause. The poor man spent the next month apologising to every dignitary within a 3-mile radius. Entertainers also lived under pressure. Performing for royalty meant delivering perfection while enduring the silence of an audience too afraid to react naturally. Many performers finished their acts sweating nervously, wondering whether polite stillness meant approval or upcoming exile. A violinist in the Neapolitan court once fainted because he assumed the lack of applause meant the king despised him, only to learn that the king did not wish to break the spell of the music. Lovely sentiment, terrifying delivery. And so court entertainment became a paradox, breathtaking artistry paired with ironclad etiquette. Beauty performed for people who were too frightened to sneeze, shift, blink too loudly, or clap incorrectly. Because in the palace nothing was simple, not even joy. If you think getting ready for a first date is stressful, the outfit decisions, the grooming panic, the silent prayer that you don't smell like anxiety, imagine preparing yourself not for romance, but for a monarch. Royal courts didn't just expect you to look good. They expected you to look immaculate, polished, fragrant, and spiritually prepared to be observed under a metaphorical microscope. The average courtier spent more time maintaining their appearance than most modern people spend maintaining their homes. Welcome to the grooming standards of royal courts, where cleanliness was optional, but the appearance of cleanliness was mandatory. Let's begin with bathing, because bathing frequency varied wildly depending on the era and the monarch's personal philosophy about water touching the human body. In some courts, like those of the Ottoman sultans or certain Indian kingdoms, Regular bathing was considered essential and even luxurious. Palace bathhouses were architectural masterpieces, filled with steam, marble, and attendants whose primary job was making sure nobles didn't drown while admiring their reflections. But in other courts, particularly some European ones, bathing was viewed with suspicion. Many believed water could carry illness or weaken the body. So instead of bathing, nobles relied on linen shirts to absorb impurities and on layers of perfume strong enough to intoxicate anyone standing downwind. The French court during the 17th century was famous for this paradox. Versailles was the birthplace of elegance, luxury, and stench. People applied perfume as if trying to fumigate themselves. Entire rooms smelled like a botanical garden locked in mortal combat with a soap factory. Regardless of bathing frequency, one rule reigned supreme: you could not smell human. Human scent was classified somewhere between unfortunate and unacceptable. Courtiers wore perfumes, scented powders, aromatic gloves, ribbon sachets, and occasionally dried herbs inside their clothing. Some carried small pomanders, ornate metal balls filled with spices, which they sniffed constantly to avoid fainting from the pungent mixture of sweat, cosmetics, and questionable hygiene choices swirling through the palace air. But perfume wasn't just about pleasant smells, it was about status. The right scent could elevate you, the wrong scent could ruin you. Perfumes made from rare ingredients, ambergris, musk, rose-oiled, were treasured. Perfumes that smelled too strong or too cheap were judged harshly. One duchess in Spain was once asked to leave a reception because her perfume was aggressively floral. That's royal court language for your scent has become a weapon. Next came wigs, which deserve their own chapter in the history of extreme grooming. During certain periods, especially in France and England, wigs weren't just fashion accessories, they were symbols of political presence. The bigger the wig, the more important you appeared. Some wigs rose so high they required architectural support and a personal assistant to help the wearer fit through doors. Wigs had to be powdered, brushed, and arranged with mathematical precision. Powdering was messy but essential. Clouds of scented powder filled rooms like indoor weather systems, settling on wigs, shoulders, furniture, and guests who walked too closely. A courtier whose wig lost shape mid-event risked being viewed as unstable, socially, politically, and possibly mentally. Facial hair had its own rulebook. In some courts, beards signalled wisdom and masculinity. In others, beards were banned because they made the court look unkempt. Moustaches? Conditional. Stubble? Absolutely not. You could either be clean-shaven or elaborately bearded, but nothing in between. A half-grown beard suggested indecision, and indecision suggested weakness. A dangerous scent in political environments. Men spent hours trimming, waxing, curling and oiling their facial hair. Moustache wax became such a critical resource that shortages led to minor diplomatic arguments. A nobleman arriving at court with a drooping moustache might as well have announced that he'd overslept, lost a duel, and misplaced half his fortune. Nail care was yet another battlefield of etiquette. Nails had to be perfectly trimmed, not too long, not too short, shaped but never sharpened. This was not the Roman gladiator arena after all. Dirty nails could end your reputation. One courtier at Versailles was allegedly denied entry to a private audience because a single speck of dirt lurked beneath his thumb. He blamed it on gardening. The court blamed it on barbarism. Women's nails required even more attention. Court ladies polished them with oils, buffed them to a shine, and sometimes tinted them subtly using plant dyes. Natural-looking beauty was the expectation, but a natural look that took 3 hours of preparation and the assistance of 2 maids. But the most overlooked yet critical part of grooming was shoes. A courtier's shoes had to gleam with a level of shine that could blind passing servants. They were polished, buffed, massaged with wax, and maintained like royal relics. Anyone entering the throne room with scuffed shoes was viewed as sloppy at best, treason adjacent at worst. Shoes with dust on them, unimaginable. Shoes making squeaky sounds, a social crime. Shoes that didn't match the outfit, sacrilegious. In many courts, particularly in East Asia and the Ottoman Empire, footwear etiquette became even more complex. Shoes had to be removed in some areas, cleaned constantly, or carefully chosen for ceremonies. In Japan, entering a noble residence with dirty footwear was an insult to the host, equivalent to tracking disrespect across their floors. Hair too demanded absolute obedience. Court hairstyles reflected discipline and status. A loose strand of hair was not a stray hair, it was a character flaw. Adjusting hair in front of the monarch? Forbidden. Adjusting hair at all? Only under the supervision of attendants. Women braided, pinned, curled, twisted, and decorated their hair to perfection. Hairstyles grew taller, more elaborate, more fragile. One English noblewoman's hairstyle became so structurally complex that she was rumoured to sleep sitting upright for 6 months. And then there were eyebrows. Yes, eyebrows had rules. In some courts they were shaped thin and curved, in others thick and bold. Overplucked, too vain, underplucked, too primitive. A noble woman in the Spanish court once cried after a portrait revealed her eyebrows looking rebelliously expressive. The irony of it all was simple. Courts didn't require actual cleanliness. They required the illusion of cleanliness, wealth, restraint, and divine perfection. A courtier's grooming was not for health, it was for optics. Every polished shoe, powdered wig, scented glove, and smooth strand of hair existed to send one message. I am worthy of being here. Please don't exile me. And so, day after day, noble prepared themselves like works of living art, praying that no bead of sweat or stray scent betrayed them in front of the throne. If you have ever made awkward small talk at an office party, imagine that experience, but add the threat of exile, humiliation, or a career-ending rumour if you say the wrong thing. Conversation in the royal court wasn't a pleasant exchange of words, it was a tactical exercise in verbal acrobatics. The goal wasn't to communicate, it was to survive, to appear charming without being bold, intelligent without being threatening, witty without being memorable, and polite without being passive. In other words, the fine art of talking for hours while saying absolutely nothing. Welcome to courtly small talk, the deadliest sport without weapons. The first rule was simple: never say anything you actually think. Your opinions had no place here. Even your personality had to be carefully wrapped in silk before being allowed near royalty. Conversations were not about expressing ideas, they were about navigating social hierarchies with the grace of someone tiptoeing across a tightrope made of gossip and powdered wigs. Let's begin with the most treacherous conversational territory: compliments. A compliment in a royal court was not a spontaneous gesture, it was a diplomatic manoeuvre. Too much enthusiasm suggested insincerity or manipulation. Too little enthusiasm suggested a lack of loyalty. A compliment delivered too quickly seemed rehearsed. A compliment delivered too slowly seemed reluctant. Compliment the monarch incorrectly and congratulations, you've offended the crown. Compliment another noble too lavishly, and now you're hinting they're more magnificent than the monarch, which is a crime punishable by silent ostracism and a lifetime of being seated near draughty hallways. The perfect court compliment was a masterpiece of moderation. Your Majesty looks radiant today, as always, of course, but perhaps with a touch of extra celestial glow. This flattered, but didn't imply inconsistency. It praised, but didn't imply comparison. It said everything and absolutely nothing simultaneously. Complimenting fashion was safest, but even that had rules. Your gown is exquisite was acceptable. Your gown is surprisingly exquisite was not. And where did you get it was grounds for immediate social execution, because one never implied the monarch shopped like ordinary mortals. Next came gossip, which was both the court's lifeblood and its most dangerous pastime. Gossip was everywhere, floating through hallways, whispered behind fans, exchanged through cryptic glances, sliding through corridors like smoke with malicious sparkle. However, gossip had boundaries. You could participate, but only in the shallowest, most indirect ways. You could never be the source of gossip. You could never repeat a rumour as fact. And you could never, under any circumstances, comment on royal family gossip, even if the scandal was so public that chickens in nearby villages had begun clucking about it. Safe gossip topics included weather patterns. The clouds seemed very dignified today. Dogs. Oh yes, the Duke's Spaniel is wonderfully obedient. Harmless observations. I hear the gardens will be trimmed in a new style. Distant nobles no one liked. Countess so-and-so is very enthusiastic in her fashion choices. Dangerous topics included royal marriages, instant death. Royal finances, double death. Court rivalries, social death, which was sometimes worse. Anything the monarch had not personally commented on first. Court conversation required the ability to glide around sensitive topics like a dancer avoiding traps on stage. People didn't express opinions, they expressed shapes of opinions. Instead of saying, I disagree, one might say, how fascinating, I'd never considered that perspective. Instead of saying, that sounds terrible, one offered, that is certainly a development. You also had to master the most essential conversational skill of all, the humble pivot. This was the ability to change the topic gracefully whenever the conversation drifted toward danger. If someone accidentally steered towards scandal, a skilled courtier could redirect with the agility of a fox escaping a hound. Oh, the Duke's gambling debts. How unfortunate. Speaking of fortunes, have you seen the new tapestries? Which brings us to the Queen's most dreaded question, one that could expose your status, wealth, achievements, and insecurities all at once. So what do you do? This question wasn't actually a question. It was a test, a trap, a linguistic snare set with velvet and smiles. The Queen already knew what you did. Everyone knew what everyone did, but she wanted to hear how you described it. Say too much and you sounded boastful. Say too little and you sounded useless. Say the truth and you risked revealing ambition, a forbidden scent at court. The only safe response was to downplay your abilities while sounding honoured to be alive in the monarch's vicinity. I have the privilege of assisting in matters most insignificant yet humbly essential to your Majesty's interests. Translation. I do things. Please don't make me explain. And then there was body language, the silent co-star of conversation. Your posture needed to say, I respect you. Your eyes needed to say, I am listening. Your smile needed to say, I am agreeable. And your hands needed to say absolutely nothing, because hands that moved too much were suspicious, dramatic, or foreign. Even laughter had strict rules. You could laugh at royal jokes, but only after the monarch did. You could chuckle at noble jokes, but only in proportion to your rank. Laugh too loudly and you were hysterical. Laugh too softly and you were unfriendly. Fail to laugh at all and you might as well pack your bags. Conversation didn't build friendship. It built alliances, impression, and whispered evaluations. A single misphrased sentence could take months to repair. A single well-timed remark could elevate you instantly. But the true essence of royal conversation was this. Everyone talked constantly, but no one said anything. Words floated through the air like decorative ribbons. Pretty, meaningless, politically safe. Silence was dangerous. Honesty was fatal. Opinions were liabilities. And so you mastered the science of saying nothing gracefully, the finest survival skill in the royal world. If you think waking up early for work is difficult, imagine waking up early to serve someone whose first thought each morning is, how many people can I terrify before breakfast? Dawn in a royal court wasn't peaceful, quiet, or cosy. It was a full-scale operation, a military-grade production, a sunrise circus of rituals, greetings, fabrics, servants, and strategic smiling by people who had not slept well since the century began. Morning etiquette in the palace began long before the monarch opened their eyes. In fact, the day for most royal attendants began at an hour that modern humans recognise only in the context of airport departures and volcanic emergencies. By 4 a.m, servants were already scurrying around like caffeinated ghosts, preparing for the sacred morning ritual known by various names across courts, the lever in France, the morning audience in England, the dawn formalities in China, and the please pretend you're enjoying this routine in many others. The first rule of dawn etiquette: never wake the monarch too early unless you want your name removed from every invitation list until the afterlife. There was a precise time at which a monarch could be awakened, and that time varied depending on personality. Some monarchs rose early, eager to begin the day by reviewing documents, ordering people around, or staring pensively out a window while imagining themselves in heroic tapestries. Others preferred to sleep late and greeted early risers with the expression of a cat that had been splashed with cold water. Woe to the servant who misjudged the morning mood. But before anyone dared touch a curtain or whisper a greeting, the attendants had to arrange the royal chamber with ritualistic perfection. Curtains had to be drawn at exactly the right speed and not too fast, which startled monarchs, not too slow, which annoyed monarchs, and with just the correct amount of morning light to create the illusion of gentle awakening rather than interrogation. The temperature had to be perfect. The air had to smell faintly of whatever the monarch preferred: lavender, sandalwood, citrus, pine, or in some cases simply not peasants. And then came the most terrifying moment: the morning greeting. Morning greetings in royal courts were not improvised. They were scripted, rehearsed, and silently judged on execution. When the monarch sat up or opened their eyes, attendants and nobles present were required to greet them with a phrase appropriate to their culture. "Good morning, Your Majesty. May the sun rise in your favour. Blessings upon your awakening. May your enemies be as sleepy as we are." But tone mattered. Too cheerful and you sounded fake. Too energetic and you risked offending a sleepy monarch. Too subdued and you risked implying the monarch looked exhausted. And never, ever mention the words tired, rest, sleep, or anything implying the monarch was human. The morning greeting was a ritual not only for the monarch, but for the courtiers allowed to witness the sacred event. In France, the king's morning rising, the lever, was a full social ceremony where nobles gathered to watch the king wake, dress, and accept greetings. It was a privilege to attend, and an even greater privilege to not yawn during it. Then came robe protocols. These were complex, sacred, and entirely non-negotiable. The monarch's morning robe was not a simple garment. It was a symbol of rulership chosen with care and presented by specific attendants whose jobs depended on not dropping it. Only certain people were allowed to hand the robe to the monarch. Others were only allowed to observe. Still others were forbidden from even glancing directly at the robe, lest they contaminate it with unworthy admiration. Robes varied depending on the monarch's mood, season, and ceremonial schedule. Winter robes were lined with fur so heavy that monarchs sometimes resembled disgruntled bears. Summer robes were light and breezy, ideal for monarchs who wanted to appear saintly in the morning light. Special event robes were masterpieces of embroidery requiring entire workshops that lived in terror of forgetting a stitch and accidentally insulting the throne. As the monarch dressed, with heavy assistance, attendants performed various duties, presenting washing basins, offering scented cloths, adjusting pillows, preparing breakfast trays, and pretending with astonishing commitment to be defeated to be doing all this at dawn. Some courts had attendants known specifically for their cheerful morning demeanour, a job description that basically required the ability to smile convincingly at 4 a.m. without crying. These sunrise attendants practiced cheerful expressions in the mirror. They perfected warm yet respectful tones. They mastered the art of speaking softly while still radiating energy, the human equivalent of glowing wallpaper. Their job was to make the monarch feel that waking up was a delightful, regal experience rather than a daily reminder of mortality. And timing mattered for everything. How early you could approach the monarch, how long you waited before speaking, when breakfast trays appeared, when documents could be presented, when the hairdresser could start rearranging royal strands into gravity-defying sculptures. All of this followed an invisible but ironclad morning schedule learned through years of practice, or painful mistakes. Even walking through the royal bedchamber required etiquette. Servants moved with slow, deliberate steps, as if afraid the floor might wake the monarch if touched incorrectly. Nobles stood at a precise angle, ensuring they were visible but not intrusive. Everyone avoided sudden movements. No one coughed. No one dropped anything. No one breathed too loudly. Breakfast itself had rules, though unlike dinner etiquette, morning meals were more private. Still, the monarch expected their food presented beautifully, at the perfect temperature, and with enough restraint that even toast looked ceremonial. Monarchs who preferred solitude dismissed most attendants after the initial rituals. Monarchs who enjoyed company invited nobles to share the morning ambiance, which sounded pleasant but was often code for "stand quietly while I eat and judge your posture." Some courts required officials to present early reports or petitions during the morning ritual. This was an honour, the kind that required perfect timing and perfect phrasing, while the monarchs still had pillow creases on their face. Present too early and you looked over-eager. Present too late and you looked incompetent. Many careers rose or fell based on whether a morning report was delivered with enough grace to disguise the presenter's internal panic. In the end, morning etiquette wasn't just about waking the monarch. It was about setting the tone for the entire day, controlling the atmosphere, reinforcing hierarchy, and ensuring the monarch felt like a celestial being emerging from the night, rather than a cranky human experiencing sunrise. And for the attendants whose day began in darkness, the rule was simple: be silent, be graceful, be cheerful, and for heaven's sake, pretend you enjoy mornings. If you think taking a casual stroll is simple, that's only because you've never tried walking in a royal court. The place where moving from point A to point B required the precision of a military parade, the grace of a ballet troupe, and the fear-driven discipline of someone who very much enjoyed still having a job. Walking wasn't transportation. Walking was ritual, hierarchy, choreography, and political messaging performed through ankles. In the palace, a walk was never merely a walk, it was a statement. Let's start with the most sacred rule of all. Never, under any circumstances, walk faster than the monarch. Overtaking the monarch was the social equivalent of climbing onto the throne, announcing new policies and redecorating their bedchamber in one swoop. Speed was status, and walking ahead of the monarch suggested authority, ambition, and possibly treasonous cardiovascular confidence. If the monarch walked slowly, you walked slowly. If the monarch paused, you paused. If the monarch wanted to stroll with the pace of a meditating tortoise, everyone behind them transcended mortal impatience and embraced the turtle lifestyle. Matching the monarch's pace required enormous skill. Too fast was dangerous. Too slow suggested mockery. Too close implied ambition. Too far implied disrespect. A good courtier hovered at the Goldilocks distance, just near enough to seem attentive, just far enough to avoid stepping on the royal hem, and just coordinated enough not to drift awkwardly like a shopping cart with a broken wheel. Walking formation, especially during official processions, was a science unto itself. In many European courts, formation resembled a pecking order diagram brought to life. High-ranking nobles walked closest to the monarch, followed by lesser nobles, followed by advisors, followed by people whose job titles were too confusing to explain politely. Positions were assigned with mathematical precision. Stand in the wrong column or drift into the wrong row and congratulations, you've staged an accidental coup. French court processions were legendary for their strict formations. Courtiers practiced their steps for days before major ceremonies. Some even rehearsed in private hallways to perfect the art of synchronizing their stride with others in their rank. If you were not perfectly aligned, someone noticed. And if someone noticed, someone whispered. And if someone whispered, your reputation took a hit it might not recover from. Spanish court etiquette elevated this to divine geometry. Walking beside the king was nearly impossible unless explicitly invited. Walking behind the king too closely was insulting. Walking too far behind was suspicious. Walking diagonally, unthinkable, unless you were trying to signal a secret alliance or the onset of madness. Walking etiquette in China's imperial court was even more elaborate. Courtyard processions were carefully choreographed spectacles representing cosmic harmony. The emperor walked in the centre, aligned with the axis of heaven. Officials walked in rows determined by rank, virtue, exam results, and sometimes astrological calculations. Your pace, posture, and angle relative to the emperor all conveyed meaning. Step out of alignment and you disrupted symbolic order. A mistake that did not go unnoticed by the dozens of officials trained precisely to notice such mistakes. The Ottoman court, especially in Topkapi Palace, demanded near giant movement. The Sultan's procession was accompanied by elite guards whose steps were perfectly synchronized, requiring others to follow with respectful distance and absolute control. Walking too loudly was forbidden. Walking casually was forbidden. Walking with the wrong posture, at the wrong angle, or with the wrong expression was also forbidden. In short, walking was a minefield. But etiquette extended beyond formal processions. It ruled the everyday act of moving through palace corridors. Corridors were political arenas disguised as hallways. If you encountered the monarch walking toward you, the rules were clear: step aside immediately. Bow or curtsy, quickly but not frantically. Keep your eyes lowered, but not so low that you appear asleep. Remain still until they have passed. Trying to share a hallway with the monarch was like trying to share air with a thunderstorm, not advisable for fragile beings. Even when the monarch was not present, corridor etiquette dictated the movement hierarchy. High-ranking nobles walked confidently down the centre. Lower-ranking nobles hugged the walls like well-dressed shadows. Servants used side routes and back passages to avoid creating traffic jams that risked noble irritation, the most lethal form of emotional congestion. Then there were the speed limits. A noble never rushed at court. Rushing was peasant-like, desperate, or suspicious. If you needed to get somewhere quickly, you perfected the art of walking briskly while appearing serene, a skill that required years of training and the leg strength of a professional dancer. Running was absolutely forbidden. Running meant panic. Running meant urgency. Running meant something terrible had happened, and courts preferred that terrible things be communicated slowly, politely, and preferably after lunchtime. The one exception was messengers, but even they jogged with the dignity of someone trying not to appear sweaty in front of portraits of ancestors. Another rule: never change direction abruptly. Sudden movements startled monarchs, guards, and especially paranoid nobles who interpreted every quick turn as the beginning of an assassination plot. If you needed to turn around, you executed a slow, controlled pivot, the royal equivalent of a submarine making a calculated maneuver. Then came the subtle rules. You never walked beside someone of higher rank unless invited. You never walked behind someone of lower rank unless avoiding them altogether was impossible. You never blocked doorways. Doorways were political choke points where reputations went to die. You never walked between two people having a conversation unless you wanted both enemies and rumours. Walking while speaking required even more finesse. You had to speak softly enough not to annoy the monarch, but clearly enough that your companion could hear you. Whispering suggested conspiracy. Loudness suggested disrespect. Perfect volume was somewhere between confessing a secret to a priest and ordering soup politely. Lastly, the golden rule of royal movement. If the monarch stops walking, you stop breathing. Not literally, of course, but close enough. When the monarch paused to look at art, greet someone, or contemplate their own grandeur, all movement behind them halted. Courtiers froze mid-step like mannequins caught in philosophical thought. Only when the monarch started walking again did the procession resume, as if someone pressed play on the world. Walking at court wasn't just motion, it was hierarchy expressed through locomotion, a ballet of power, a parade of obedience, a reminder that even your footsteps belong to the crown. When you imagine royal banquets, towering feasts, glittering goblets, enough roasted animals to populate a zoo, you probably think of indulgence, extravagance, and gluttony with a side of politics. But behind the luxury lay a maze of food rules so bewildering, so treacherous, and so potentially career-ending that nobles often approached dinner with the cautious dread of someone diffusing an edible explosive. In the royal court, eating wasn't pleasure. It was protocol, symbolism, and a daily risk assessment. Let's begin with the most basic truth. Not everyone could eat everything. Forbidden foods were everywhere, barred by custom, law, superstition, religious doctrine, or the monarch's personal whims, which were often more unpredictable than the weather. One monarch banned garlic because he believed it made people think rebellious thoughts. Another banned eels because they looked suspicious. A third banned apples because they reminded him of a childhood tutoring mishap. You might laugh, but if the king hated apples, you hated apples too. Nobles lived under layers of food restrictions designed to maintain hierarchy even at the dinner table. Some foods were exclusive to the monarch, not because the monarch particularly wanted them, but because allowing anyone else to eat them implied dangerous equality. For example, in medieval England, swans were royal property. Only the monarch could authorise their consumption. Eating an unauthorised swan was treated like culinary treason. In imperial China, particular cuts of pork were reserved for the emperor. Eating the wrong cut in the wrong place could be viewed as symbolic overstepping. In the Ottoman Empire, certain delicacies were prepared exclusively in the palace kitchens and were forbidden elsewhere. They weren't just meals, they were edible declarations of power. But for nobles, forbidden foods weren't only about royal privilege, they were about rank. Different ranks had different dietary rights. A duke could eat foods a baron could not. A baron could eat foods an ordinary knight could not. A knight could eat foods a merchant technically could afford, but was absolutely forbidden to enjoy. Hierarchy didn't stop at clothes or chairs, it extended straight onto the dinner plate. Then came religious restrictions, which layered additional rules onto the already complicated dinner landscape. In Christian courts, fasting days dictated which foods were acceptable. But here's the catch. Fasting rules were often applied differently depending on status. Monarchs could bend rules, nobles could wiggle around them. Servants? Servants complied fully, though they sometimes watched nobles gorge on loophole-approved dishes with thinly veiled envy. During Lent, for instance, most people abstained from meat, but in certain courts, beaver tails were mysteriously classified as fish due to their aquatic lifestyle, allowing nobles to enjoy rich stews without technically breaking religious law. The monks weren't fooled, but the nobles pretended not to care. At Islamic courts, particularly in the Middle East, halal dietary rules governed permissible foods, but monarchs layered court-specific rules over them. Certain dishes could only be prepared by palace chefs, and some meals were restricted to specific ceremonies. Serving the wrong dish at the wrong time wasn't just improper, it was sacrilegious. In Hindu royal courts, cows were sacred, so beef was forbidden. But there were additional ceremonial rules around who could prepare food and how it was served. Violating these rituals, even accidentally, was enough to spark political tension or intense religious consultation. Next came symbolic foods, dishes chosen not for taste but for meaning. These symbolic foods were woven deeply into ceremony, diplomacy, and royal superstition. For example, in some African courts, eating certain nuts symbolized unity. Eating them out of order symbolized disrespect. In Japanese courts, particular sweets were served to show purity, renewal, or gratitude. Eating them incorrectly was like reading a poem backward, jarring and rude. In European courts, the consumption of certain breads symbolized loyalty. But tearing bread the wrong way could be interpreted as symbolic defiance, which is an absurd amount of pressure to place on baked goods. And then there were the danger foods. Foods so politically charged that even touching them in the wrong context triggered chaos. One infamous case occurred in Renaissance Italy, where a nobleman accidentally ate a particular slice of melon reserved for the duke. Witnesses reported that the colour drained from his face faster than the juice dripped from the fruit. He apologised immediately, dramatically, repeatedly, and loudly enough that the entire table stopped eating. The duke ultimately forgave him, but only after 2 weeks of public grovelling and a very expensive apology banquet. Another tragicomic incident took place in the Mughal court. A foreign ambassador, unfamiliar with local customs, took a large bite of a dessert meant exclusively for the emperor. Anxious attendants watched in horror. Fortunately, the emperor found the confusion amusing and declared that the guest had excellent taste. Unfortunately, other nobles who'd been eyeing the dessert for years did not share this opinion. Even drinks had their own rules. Wine, fine, unless it came from a region the monarch disliked. Tea, perfect, no, unless it was brewed too strongly, too weakly, or with leaves associated with rival court factions. Liquor, acceptable, unless you finished your glass too quickly, which signalled lack of restraint, or too slowly, which signalled lack of enthusiasm. And the worst crime of all, drinking before the monarch took the first sip. Doing so was effectively shouting, "I am more important than the throne," and nobody survived that accusation. Sometimes the monarch's personal preferences complicated everything. A king who hated onions? Onions disappeared from court menus. A queen who liked her soup lukewarm? Everyone pretended lukewarm soup was the height of sophistication. If the monarch declared a sudden hatred for fish, the entire palace went fishless until further notice, even during fasting seasons, because religious obligation was strong, but royal irritation was stronger. But perhaps the most anxiety-inducing part of these food rules was the chance of eating the wrong food in front of the wrong person. A noble nibbling on meat during a fast could offend religious advisors. A diplomat eating with their left hand could offend cultural norms. A courtier grabbing a fruit reserved for the heir could offend the royal bloodline. A guest accepting food after declining 3 times, the required polite number, could offend the hostess. And then there were misunderstandings of culinary etiquette, so severe they became historical legends. One English ambassador in an Eastern court once ate a dish meant to be a symbolic offering instead of a meal. Another noble in a German court accidentally drank from the ceremonial goblet used to bless the year's harvest, an act equivalent to spiritually robbing an entire kingdom of its agricultural luck. In the royal court, food wasn't nourishment. Food was philosophy. Food was politics. Food was a silent linguistic system where every bite had meaning. And the most important rule of all, eat carefully, eat respectfully. And if you're unsure whether a dish is allowed, admire it from a safe distance and pretend you're full. If you think modern dating is complicated and the texting anxiety, the unspoken expectations, the emotional tightrope of did they like my message or just acknowledge it, try romance in a royal court. Courtship wasn't flirting. It wasn't love. It wasn't even personal. It was a strategic performance of glances, gestures, and regulations so suffocating that actual affection had to fight through enough protocol to rival a diplomatic treaty. Romance with 900 rules attached? A generous underestimate. In a royal court, flirting had to be done with the subtlety of a feather floating across a marble floor, noticeable if you looked carefully, deniable if anyone important asked about it. Every gesture had a meaning, every gaze had a rank, every smile had the political explosiveness of a small cannon. Let's begin with the foundational truth. You could flirt, but only in ways that suggested you weren't flirting. Anything overt was scandalous. Anything too hidden was useless. Romance was a balancing act between I adore you and I barely know you exist, performed under the watchful eyes of approximately 50 servants, 2 chaperones, 3 suspicious aunts, and at least 1 political rival. The safest form of flirting was the acceptable glance, a brief, respectful look across the room that lasted no longer than the time it took for a candle to flicker. If the glance lingered, it became suggestive. If it flickered rapidly, it was nervous or undignified. A perfect courtly glance hovered somewhere between admiration and ophthalmology. Smiles were permitted, but strictly regulated. A smile with teeth, too forward. A smile with dimples, dangerously intimate. A smile lasting more than 2 seconds. Scandal. The ideal courtly smile was a soft upward curl of the lips suggesting mild appreciation, as if you'd just seen a slightly interesting flower. Conversation between potential lovers had its own limitations. You could speak, but never alone. A courtship conversation always required witnesses, usually a pair of older relatives with suspicious eyebrows, or attendants whose main job was pretending not to hear anything. Conversations were supposed to be polite, restrained, and devoid of any real information. A typical exchange might go something like, "He, the weather has been most agreeable." She, "Indeed, it has been appropriately seasonal." He, "Very seasonal." She, "Quite." If this sounds like two people awkwardly reading from dictionaries, that's because they were. Anything deeper risked implying emotional intimacy, a horror the court tried desperately to prevent unless properly approved by several committees and, ideally, a priest. Touching, of course, was forbidden without 6 layers of permission. The most scandalous contact two people could share was the accidental brushing of fingertips during a formal dance, and even that was monitored like a crime scene. A brief touch could spark gossip. A slightly longer touch could ignite rumours. An intentional touch, that was effectively proposing marriage with witnesses, fireworks, and a pre-written scandal pamphlet distributed by your enemies. Dances, ironically, were one of the only legitimate ways to express attraction. But even dances had rules. Partners had to maintain correct distance, close enough to be socially acceptable, far enough that no one suspected secret passion. A dance was court-approved flirting, but only if performed with proper posture, proper expression, and proper emotional constipation. But real romance at court didn't rely on gestures alone. It required permission, and permission required politics. Engagements among nobles were not personal decisions. They were strategic alliances negotiated by parents, advisors, and occasionally monarchs who treated matchmaking the way generals treat battle formations. A noble's engagement could unite territories, strengthen family power, settle disputes, or produce heirs that kept dynasties intact. Love was optional. Land and influence, mandatory. Before a couple could even dream of an engagement, they needed approval from their families, their monarch, their reputation, their rivals, and sometimes, just to complicate things, the church. Any romance not properly vetted was considered reckless, rebellious, and emotionally dangerous to national stability. In practice, this meant young nobles rarely controlled their own romantic destinies. Even the suggestion of interest required months of formal negotiation. And yet, despite all these restrictions, romance blossomed. Not through words or touch, but through ritualized signals courts carefully designed to be both expressive and deniable. Some courts used fans for secret codes. Fan held near cheek. Interest. Fan snapped shut. Disinterest. Fan waved swiftly. You're about to faint, or politely asking someone to go away. A misplaced fan gesture could accidentally propose marriage, break up with someone, or declare social war. Court ladies practiced fan language the way diplomats practiced treaties. Men, meanwhile, relied on a whole separate system of non-verbal cues. A bow slightly deeper than required signalled admiration. A slower than normal step during a promenade hinted at interest. Offering a handkerchief, too bold. Dropping a handkerchief so the lady could pick it up, also too bold. Dropping a handkerchief for a servant to return to the lady, acceptable. Barely. Even gifts were restricted. A flower could signify affection, but only if it was the publicly approved flower for that season. A ribbon, scandal. A poem, dangerous. A single glove, symbolic beyond comprehension. Giving someone your glove was akin to handing over a legally binding romantic contract endorsed by your soul. But despite these suffocating rules, passion found loopholes. People found ways to express love hidden behind etiquette. Secret glances during court audiences, letters disguised as religious reflections, coordinated outfits with matching colours, mutually agreed upon pauses during a dance, accidental seating proximity at banquets. And yes, occasionally lovers escape the palace entirely to pursue a private romance, much to the horror of everyone invested in preventing unauthorized happiness. These cases were rare but dramatic, usually resulting in frantic chases, tearful family meetings, and royal decrees written with the irritated flourish of someone who resented being dragged into a love story. The biggest irony? Despite its 900 rules, courtship etiquette wasn't designed to prevent romance. It was designed to contain it, to keep personal emotions from spilling into political chaos. Because in the royal court, romance was less about passion and more about strategy. Less about hearts and more about houses. Less about love and more about lineage. And yet somehow love survived, politely, discreetly and monitored by 50 servants pretending they saw nothing at all. If you think your nightly routine is dramatic, fluffing pillows, adjusting blankets, possibly glaring at a mosquito, royal bedtime was a full-blown ceremonial event. In the palace, going to sleep wasn't a private act. It was a ritual, performance, a meticulously choreographed sequence requiring a cast of attendants, an atmosphere of reverence, and enough etiquette to make even the pillows feel nervous. For monarchs, bedtime wasn't relaxation. It was political theatre with blankets. Let's begin with the sacred space itself, the royal bedchamber, one of the most restricted territories in the palace. Entering this room required permission so rare that being invited inside was considered a badge of trust, closeness, or, depending on the monarch, a dangerous level of responsibility. Many nobles spent their entire lives manoeuvring for an audience in the king's or queen's bedroom, not to witness anything scandalous, but simply to be seen assisting with the nightly rituals. Being present for bedtime meant being part of the inner circle. Being absent meant being part of the decorative outer layer. But presence was not the same as comfort. Anyone admitted into the royal bedroom had to follow rules so precise they felt like instructions for defusing a bomb. You entered only when summoned. You stepped only where carpets allowed. You did not wander. You did not comment on the decor. You absolutely did not sit on the bed, lean on the bed, look at the bed, or think suspiciously about the bed. The royal bed was practically holy furniture, a symbol of dynastic continuity, national stability, and the place where future heirs hopefully came from after sufficiently elaborate negotiations. Preparing it was an honour bestowed upon trusted attendants who performed the task with a solemnity usually reserved for religious rituals. They fluffed pillows with ceremonial restraint, arranged blankets with geometric precision, and ensured that not a single wrinkle dared to appear when the monarch approached. A wrinkle in the blanket could be interpreted as a bad omen, a sign of servant negligence or, horror of horrors, an implication that the monarch might sleep imperfectly. Bedmaking itself followed strict choreography. Attendants did not simply make the bed. They inspected the mattress for softness, firmness and omens, depending on the century. Smoothed the sheets in synchronized motions. Folded the top blanket at a specific angle representing respect, comfort, or royal preference. Placed pillows like sacred offerings. Adjusted the canopy to cascade dramatically but not aggressively. Some courts even had bed testers, servants whose job was to lay on the royal bed beforehand to ensure the mattress was comfortable, safe, and not harbouring unexpected critters. This was considered an honour, though it was also a polite acknowledgement that the palace occasionally had rodent problems. Then came the matter of entering and leaving the bedroom. Entering required silence. Leaving required even more silence. No one could leave the room until dismissed. And no one could walk backwards. That was considered disrespectful except in specific cultures where backing out was required. Instead, courtiers developed a graceful sideways drift, like polite crabs, aiming to exit without turning their backs to royalty or tripping over the furniture. Many ankles suffered in service to this rule. Now for the main event, the monarch's nighttime ceremony, which varied dramatically across cultures. In France, especially at Versailles, the coucher, the king's going to bed ceremony, was a major social ritual. Dozens of nobles crowded into the room just to watch the king change into his nightshirt, an oddly prestigious spectacle resembling a cross between a religious rite and backstage access to an opera. Only certain nobles were allowed to hand the king specific items. One might hold the royal shirt, another the nightcap, another a candle. It was like being cast in a play where your line was "Here, sire," and getting the timing wrong could doom your career. In England, bedtime rituals were slightly more modest but still elaborate. Attendants helped the monarch undress with careful respect, ensuring each garment was handled delicately and ceremonially. A misbuttoned sleeve or overly enthusiastic tug could imply carelessness, or even, in paranoid courts, assassination attempts disguised as wardrobe malfunctions. In the Ottoman palace, nighttime rituals involved fragrant oils, cooling cloths, and attendants who prepared the room with quiet reverence. The Sultan's bedchamber was guarded by eunuchs who enforced strict boundaries to ensure no one approached at the wrong moment. Every part of the ritual signalled order, serenity, and the absolute separation between the ruler's private rest and the chaos of the world. In East Asian courts, nighttime practices blended symbolism with sacred meaning. In Japan, members of the imperial household followed precise protocols when extinguishing lamps or adjusting bedding, ensuring harmony in the sleeping environment. In China, attending the emperor's bedchamber was a position of immense trust, and nighttime rituals reflected cosmic order. The arrangement of pillows, screens, and incense followed ancient traditions meant to protect not only the emperor's sleep, but the empire itself. Regardless of the culture, one rule was universal and terrifyingly consistent. The monarch must never feel unguarded. Even in the most intimate of nightly moments, attendants had to project calm, respect, and unwavering vigilance. Monarchs rarely slept alone. Guards patrolled outside, advisors waited within calling distance. Servants slept lightly, ready to leap into action if the monarch so much as murmured in discomfort. And hovering beside all of this was the strangest expectation of all. Everyone had to pretend the monarch's bedtime was thrilling. Attendants smiled softly, courtiers nodded solemnly. Ladies in waiting murmured polite admiration at the comfort of the royal linens. Chamberlains acted as though watching royalty enter bed was a deeply inspiring cultural experience. Even if the monarch simply yawned, people reacted with reverence, as if witnessing the divine act of a mountain settling itself for the night. When the monarch finally lay down, the room shifted into silent triumph. The attendants finished their roles, extinguished candles in precise order, and departed in choreographed lines. No one breathed too loudly. No one scuffed a shoe. No one dared sneeze. In one court, a servant who coughed during the Queen's bedtime ritual found himself reassigned to a distant estate known for its lack of people. When the chamber door closed, the palace did not sleep, but the performance paused until dawn. Because in the royal court, even bedtime was a spectacle, and the monarch never truly rested alone. If there was one force capable of rivaling royal power inside the palace, it was religion. Monarchs ruled by divine mandate, divine sanction, divine ancestry, or divine PR campaign, depending on the century, which meant that religious etiquette in royal courts wasn't just sacred, it was political dynamite with candles. One misstep during a ritual, one improperly handled relic, one misplaced kneel, and you weren't just committing a religious error. You were igniting enough chaos to keep diplomats employed for months. Religion shaped every corner of court behaviour. It dictated how nobles moved, spoke, sat, prayed, and breathed in the vicinity of sacred objects. The royal court wasn't just a political machine. It was a holy stage where everyone acted out piety under the watchful gaze of clergy, monarchs, and that one elderly courtier who had memorized every rule since 3 monarchs ago and wasn't afraid to glare at you for forgetting them. Let's begin with the most fundamental part of religious etiquette: prayer protocol. Courtiers prayed, but not freely. Prayer had rules, ranks, and choreography. You prayed when the monarch prayed. You knelt when the monarch knelt. You rose only when the monarch rose. If you moved even a second early, you appeared impatient. If you rose a second late, you looked sluggish. The ideal prayer posture mirrored the monarch's like a divine shadow. In courts like those of Catholic Spain, kneeling technique was practically a royal sport. One knee or both? How fast should you descend? How sharply should your back align? These things mattered. A noble once became infamous because he knelt too enthusiastically, slamming his knee into the marble so loudly that a cardinal flinched. the incident was quietly recorded as excessive zeal unbecoming of refined devotion. In orthodox courts, such as Russia or Byzantium, crossing yourself followed strict rhythms: forehead, stomach, right shoulder, left shoulder. Do it out of order and you didn't just embarrass yourself. You insulted centuries of tradition and risked starting rumours that you'd been influenced by heretical foreigners. Some vigilant courtiers watched others' hand movements with the same intensity they reserved for battlefield news. In Islamic courts, prayer etiquette reflected deep reverence. The sultan or caliph prayed facing the Qibla, and the posture, silence, and devotion surrounding the moment set the tone for the entire court. Anyone whispering, moving, or adjusting their robe during prayer risked reprimand or expulsion. At one Ottoman ceremony, a noble attempting to fix his sandal strap mid-prayer caused such scandalized gasps that he later claimed to have heard them in his sleep for months. Next came the handling of sacred objects, which required the gentleness of handling baby birds and the reverence of handling royal tempers. In Catholic courts, relics were central, bones of saints, fragments of cloaks, splinters allegedly from holy crosses. These were housed in golden reliquaries more lavish than some palaces. Only specific clergy, nobles of particular rank, or the monarch themselves were allowed to touch these objects. Touching a relic without authorization was considered sacrilegious. Dropping one was the kind of disaster poets wrote tragedies about. In one French court anecdote, a nervous noble tasked with holding a relic sneezed while carrying it, jolting the sacred container. The relic rolled gently across the Queen's prayer cushion. Everyone froze as if the floor had become lava. Miraculously, the Queen found the incident amusing. Everyone else needed several hours and wine to recover. In Buddhist courts, such as the imperial courts of Japan, handling religious items like sutras, ceremonial offerings, or sacred images required serenity and precision. You could not turn your back on certain objects. You could not place them below certain others, and you absolutely could not carry them with anything less than perfect posture. Then there was ritual seating, a maze of divine geometry that made ordinary seating charts look like children's puzzles. Seating during religious ceremonies signified hierarchy, holiness, and political standing wrapped into one. In Christian courts, nobles were seated according to rank, seniority, and proximity to the royal bloodline. Clergy members outranked everyone except the monarch. Sitting too close to the altar when you weren't supposed to. Scandal. Sitting too far back when you were supposed to be up front. Suspicious humility, which in a royal court was considered as fake as cheap pearls. In Islamic courts, religious scholars often held places of honor. Nobles sat according to status, but proximity to respected clerics could elevate or diminish their perceived piety. A noble once shifted in his place a few inches closer to a renowned scholar during a ceremony, a subtle yet ambitious move. It backfired immediately. The monarch's eyebrows rose, the noble's rank fell. China's imperial court infused Confucian philosophy into seating arrangements. Ritual spaces were designed to reflect cosmic order, the emperor representing heaven, nobles representing earth, and ministers representing harmony. Sitting in the wrong direction was tantamount to symbolically warping the universe. One official accidentally positioned himself facing west instead of south. Astronomers were consulted. His career was not. Some courts blended religion and politics into ceremonies so delicate that a single mistake could ignite international crises. One of the most notorious occurred when a foreign ambassador in an Eastern court failed to bow deeply enough during a ritual honouring ancestral spirits. The host nation viewed the slight as an insult to their entire history. The ambassador claimed stiff knees. Diplomatic negotiations stalled for months. Another infamous incident unfolded when a European noble in a Middle Eastern court accidentally crossed his legs during a prayer gathering, a gesture considered disrespectful. The entire room inhaled sharply. The monarch handled it gracefully, but half the courtiers wrote letters that night describing the incident as the most shocking ankle event in living memory. Even more dangerous were ritual timings. Many religious ceremonies had exact starting points tied to sunrise, moon phases, or astrological calculations. Being late wasn't a simple faux pas, it was cosmic disrespect. Being early could be equally disastrous, implying impatience with sacred rhythms. A noble who rushed into a ceremony still tying their robe was later described by witnesses as spiritually reckless. Then came the emotional etiquette. During sacred rituals, courtiers had to project piety without displaying too much emotion, which could be interpreted as drama, or too little emotion, which could be seen as impiety. Crying during a prayer was acceptable only if the tears were tasteful, symmetrical, and did not cause sniffling. Laughing? Never. Looking bored? A one-way ticket to ecclesiastical scolding. Royalty themselves followed unique rules. In many Christian courts, the monarch entered last to signal divine alignment. In Islamic courts, rulers sometimes led prayers. In Buddhist courts, the monarch participated in rituals symbolizing wisdom and purity. Every gesture, every step, and every breath reinforced the connection between throne and divinity, and hovering over all of it was the ever-present fear. One wrong move could be interpreted not just as bad manners, but as heresy, insult, treason, or all three simultaneously. Religion inside the royal court wasn't merely belief, it was diplomacy, it was symbolism. It was choreography aligned with the heavens, and survival meant mastering the sacred, the political, and the profoundly awkward, all while kneeling gracefully on cold floors. If you think modern security guards have complicated jobs, imagine being tasked with protecting a monarch while also being forbidden from looking even slightly threatening. Royal courts demanded elite warriors, knights, samurai, janissaries, personal guards, who were trained to fight like forces of nature, yet behave in the monarch's presence like well-mannered houseplants. Their job was to embody strength without displaying it, vigilance without tension, and lethal skill without the faintest hint that they might use it on the crown. Military protocol inside the palace wasn't about battle. It was about obedience, posture, and the art of holding a weapon so politely it practically apologized. Let's begin with the universal rule shared by all courts. Never point anything sharp at the monarch, intentionally or otherwise. This sounds obvious until you realize how many ceremonies, salutes and honor guards involve dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people holding metal objects in tightrope formation. One accidental twitch, one overly dramatic bow, one sneeze, always the enemy of etiquette. And suddenly your honor guard looked like it was about to reenact a coup. To prevent such disasters, courts developed detailed weapon handling protocols. Swords always pointed downward, away from the monarch. Spears were held vertically unless the monarch was seated, in which case they were angled respectfully. Bows were always unstrung indoors. Arrows were kept in quivers so tightly packed that retrieving one required the effort of opening a bank vault. Some monarchs even banned certain weapons from being brought into the throne room because they looked too enthusiastic. Now let's examine salutes, which were not simple gestures, but ritualized movements requiring discipline, precision, and a level of emotional neutrality bordering on supernatural. European knights, for example, saluted by placing a hand on their chest, bowing slightly or lowering their weapons to the ground, but not too low. Excessive bowing suggested theatricality. Knights had to radiate both honour and restraint, like men who could cleave an opponent in two, but promised not to do so before lunch. At the height of chivalric courts, a knight's salute even had approved angles, too sharp and it looked aggressive, too soft and it looked lazy. One misjudged angle once led to an overly dramatic knight to smack himself in the helmet, producing a clang so loud the queen burst out laughing and the court poets composed verses about it for years. Samurai in Japanese courts followed protocols even more exacting. Their swords, sacred extensions of their spirit, were never to be touched by others and never to be unsheathed without cause. When presenting themselves to a daimyo or shogun, samurai always kneeled and placed their katana on the floor beside them, hilt pointing inward. Pointing the hilt outward implied hostility, pointing it toward the lord implied treason. Placing it incorrectly was not just a faux pas, it was an existential crisis with sharp consequences. Samurai posture was equally important. One sat with a straight back, calm demeanour, and eyes lowered just enough to show respect but not enough to appear unaware of threats. Showing too much awareness made you look paranoid, showing too little made you look incompetent. The ideal samurai presented himself as a controlled storm, dangerous but domesticated. Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman Empire, had an even more unusual etiquette: absolute silence. During palace ceremonies, they stood so still that foreign visitors occasionally mistook them for statues. Their famed discipline required them never to shift, cough, or even blink too noticeably while near the Sultan. They held their halberds with mathematical symmetry, forming a living wall of devotion and threat, but a controlled threat, channeled entirely toward enemies outside the palace. Janissaries did not salute with weapons indoors. Instead, they used subtle gestures of respect because waving a blade in the same room as the Sultan was only done once in a man's career, the last moment of it. European royal guards had their own rituals, many rooted in preventing accidental alarm. For example, guards could not swing their arms freely while walking. It looked too militaristic. They couldn't grip their weapons too tightly. It suggested they were nervous. They couldn't grip weapons too loosely. It suggested they were unprepared. They couldn't stare at the monarch. It was creepy. They couldn't look away from the monarch. It was neglectful. Finding the correct gaze, respectful yet vigilant, was a skill soldiers had to drill for years. In some courts, guards also communicated with zero verbal interaction. Special foot taps, coded breaths, or tiny shifts of posture conveyed everything from intruder approaching to "I am about to faint from standing still for 4 hours." The goal was to ensure no whisper ever disrupted the solemn illusion of perfect control. But military etiquette inside the palace wasn't just visual, it was deeply symbolic. Weapons symbolized loyalty, armor symbolized service, formation symbolized hierarchy, and the presence of elite warriors symbolized the monarch's unshakable command. Because of this, even the smallest breach carried enormous meaning. One of the most infamous breaches occurred in a European court when a guard accidentally unsheathed his sword while adjusting his belt. The room went silent. Courtiers panicked. Someone fainted with such force that 2 footmen had to drag them away like a fallen tree. The guard was instantly pardoned, but only after a written explanation, 5 witnesses, and a full reenactment to prove he'd simply been clumsy and not launching a one-man rebellion. Another scandal happened in a Southeast Asian court when a visiting soldier from a foreign delegation saluted with his weapon upright. An innocent gesture back home, but a symbolic declaration of aggression in that culture. Negotiations nearly collapsed until the translators scrambled to explain that the soldier had simply been very proud of his spear. Even proximity had rules. How close a warrior could stand to the monarch varied by culture. In some African kingdoms, elite warriors stood very near to demonstrate loyalty and courage. In Chinese courts, guards kept greater distance to preserve the imperial aura. In French courts, guards could stand closer than nobles, but only if their uniforms were spotless, their breath undetectable, and their boots polished to a blinding shine. Weapons had to remain in safe mode, meaning blades angled down, spears grounded, bows unstrung, shields positioned without suggesting combat. One wrong angle could send the wrong message. In one anecdote, a guard resting his spear too casually caused rumours that he had insulted the monarch with a disrespectful posture. The scandal lasted 3 weeks. Ultimately, military etiquette inside the palace existed to accomplish one goal: make the monarch feel invincible without suggesting the monarch could ever be in danger. A paradox, yes, but elite warriors mastered it. Their presence said, "I could defeat any enemy and accept the one I serve." Festivals and holidays in a royal court weren't simply celebrations. They were precision-engineered spectacles that blended joy, terror, glitter, music, and enough etiquette to frighten a monastery. These weren't the kind of holidays where people wore pajamas until noon, or pretended fruitcake was edible. No, royal festivals were public performances of loyalty, magnificence, and festively muted panic. Because nothing reminded nobles of their fragile status like accidentally violating a seasonal protocol in full view of a monarch, a choir, and 300 spectators with gossip-ready tongues. The first thing to understand is that every seasonal court event, from midwinter feast to spring dances to summer fireworks, came with a unique rule book. And these rules weren't optional. You couldn't simply attend a banquet. You had to attend it the correct way, walking correctly, greeting correctly, wearing the correct colours, eating the correct symbolic foods, dancing the correct choreography, and pretending you understood the significance of everything even when you absolutely did not. Let's begin with festive greetings, because they were a trap disguised as politeness. Holiday greetings at court were never casual. You did not simply say, "Happy New Year, Your Majesty." You said something like, "May the blessings of the season illuminate your reign with prosperity, longevity, and celestial harmony." You had to sound poetic, reverent, festive, and deeply terrified of getting a single adjective wrong. A misphrased greeting could imply the monarch lacked prosperity or longevity, or harmony or celestial anything, which was the courtly equivalent of spitting in the punch bowl. Some cultures had even stricter rules. In certain East Asian courts, you bowed at a specific angle depending on the festival. In European courts, holidays required special phrases with approved vocabulary. In some Middle Eastern courts, greetings involved prayers tuned to seasonal blessings, and heaven help the poor diplomat who mixed up two greetings at a ceremony. One ambassador once wished a monarch abundant harvests during a winter solstice celebration, a well-meaning sentiment that implied the kingdom was agriculturally unstable. He spent the rest of the holiday pretending to admire tapestries while internally composing apologies. Next came holiday dances, which were as treacherous as they were elegant. Seasonal dances were often symbolic: spring dances for renewal, summer dances for vigour, autumn dances for wealth, winter dances for endurance. But symbolism didn't excuse mistakes. If the monarch participated in the dance, a rare but nerve-wracking honour, everyone's job was to avoid stepping too close, stepping too far, stepping on any hems, stepping on anyone's dignity. Dancers practiced for days beforehand. A single misstep could imply disrespect, incompetence, or, worst of all, suggest the monarch had poor rhythm. And if you accidentally bumped the monarch during a court dance, congratulations, you just reinvented public humiliation. Now let's discuss masquerades, the most chaotic of all seasonal events, and somehow the most regulated. Masquerades in royal courts were not free-for-alls of mischief. They were theatrical hierarchies wearing masks. Costumes had rules, masks had rules. Even the types of jokes you could make while disguised had rules. A noble couldn't dress above their rank, no impersonating gods, monarchs, or symbolic animals associated with the dynasty. One lady in an Italian court once arrived dressed as a phoenix, forgetting that the phoenix was the emblem of the ruling family. The queen didn't say anything, but the look she delivered could have extinguished 3 suns. Mask etiquette was equally complicated. You could flirt behind the mask, but only within your rank. You could tease, but only gently. You could dance with someone unexpected, but not too unexpected. And unmasking was a ceremony all on its own. You did not remove your mask without permission, especially not in front of the monarch. One overeager courtier once revealed his face early, thinking it would charm the princess. Instead, it charmed the guards, who escorted him from the room so swiftly he barely had time to blink. Then came feasts, which differed from normal court dinners through the addition of ceremonial foods, elaborate performances, and dangerous rules regarding seasonal dishes. Certain foods had symbolic meanings: prosperity nuts, fertility fruits, longevity fish, liberation loaves, and one could not consume them casually. Eat the symbolic dish too early and you insulted tradition. Eat it too late and you insulted the kitchen. Do not eat it at all. Treason adjacent. Then there were holiday gift exchanges, which were diplomatic minefields disguised as generosity. You had to choose a gift appropriate to both the season and the monarch's mood. Too grand, and it implied competition. Too humble, and it implied disrespect. Too symbolic, and you risked hinting at political messages you didn't intend. One count accidentally gifted a king an ornamental tree that symbolized new beginnings. Sounds harmless, until the court interpreted it as you should step aside for your heir. Negotiations were needed, clarifications were sought. The tree was quietly moved to a distant garden. But perhaps the most dramatic etiquette concerns emerged during fireworks, which became popular entertainment in courts from China to France. Fireworks were impressive, but they were also explosive, unpredictable, and very capable of causing diplomatic incidents. Standing near the monarch during fireworks required perfect emotional control. You had to look awestruck, but not too awestruck. You had to appear fearless, even when a rocket misfired and sailed ominously low across the courtyard. You could not flinch, because flinching suggested cowardice. You could not duck, because ducking suggested survival instinct, something court etiquette discouraged. If a firework exploded unexpectedly loud, you were expected to maintain noble composure. A single noble woman in a German court once shrieked mid-explosion, and for months afterward, people whispered she lacked seasonal courage. Courtiers also had to avoid blocking the monarch's view, standing taller than the monarch, even accidentally via a raised platform, commenting on the fireworks unless asked, complaining about smoke suggesting improvements to the pyrotechnics. The monarch's reaction dictated everyone else's. If the monarch nodded with calm enjoyment, courtiers nodded too. If the monarch looked impressed, courtiers smiled politely. If the monarch looked bored, courtiers pretended boredom was fashionable. But under no circumstances did anyone clap too loudly. No royale wanted to be outshined by explosives or enthusiasm. Seasonal etiquette, in short, turned holidays into tightrope walks. It blended joy with anxiety, merriment with precision, spectacle with strategy, because in the royal court nothing, not even celebration, was free of meaning. If you think handling in-laws is stressful, imagine handling foreign ambassadors, people who arrived carrying letters from distant monarchs, demands wrapped in flowery language, and enough political sensitivity that even the angle of your bow could accidentally start a war. Diplomatic etiquette in royal courts wasn't just about courtesy. It was about national survival, and every royal palace operated under one sacred principle. Whatever you do, do not offend the ambassador. Of course, despite everyone's best efforts, this happened constantly. The arrival ritual, where first impressions could trigger an international crisis. The arrival of a foreign envoy was one of the most choreographed events in any royal court. The correct number of guards had to greet them. The correct number of servants had to accompany them. The correct number of ceremonial steps had to be walked. If even one of these numbers was wrong, the envoy might interpret it as mockery, disrespect, or an intentional diplomatic slap. In some courts, such as the Ottoman Empire, ambassadors were escorted through deliberately confusing corridors to impress them with imperial size and security. In other courts, like Ming and Qing China, the envoy's arrival procession wasn't merely ceremony. It reflected their country's rank in the cosmic order. Woe to the envoy who stepped out of line, bowed incorrectly, or breathed too enthusiastically. Even where ambassadors were seated upon arrival sent a political message. Too close to the throne meant overvaluing them. Too far meant belittling them. On the wrong side, potential chaos. One memorable incident occurred in a German court where a French envoy was accidentally placed on the less honourable side of the hall. He refused to sit. The meeting stalled for 3 hours. The French king later complained in a letter so furiously polite it was basically a diplomatic insult wrapped in sugar. Bowing without causing war. Bowing, you'd think it would be simple. Bend politely. Smile politely, avoid falling over. But no, bowing to a foreign envoy or bowing as a foreign envoy was a linguistic act more complex than any treaty ever written. Different cultures had different bow expectations. Japanese envoys bowed deeply. European monarchs bowed only slightly or not at all. Chinese emperors expected the kowtow, full prostration, a gesture many foreign ambassadors refused because it implied inferior sovereignty. Persian courts considered certain bows insulting unless accompanied by precise hand gestures. One of the most infamous diplomatic disasters in world history occurred when British envoy Lord Macartney refused to perform the kowtow before the Qianlong Emperor. Britain insisted on equal monarch-to-monarch respect. China interpreted this as foreign arrogance. The result? Years of frosty relations and mutual irritation, all because two empires couldn't agree on how low someone should bend. In some courts, bowing too deeply suggested desperation. In others, bowing too shallowly suggested arrogance. A Spanish diplomat once bowed so cautiously in France that the entire room whispered he was mocking the king's shoes. The rumour lasted longer than his career. Gift exchanges, the most polite minefield ever invented. If royal courts feared anything more than bowing mistakes, it was gift exchanges with foreign emissaries. Gifts weren't objects, they were coded political messages. The wrong gift could cause offence, the right gift could forge alliances, and the tragically ambiguous gift could cause everyone to panic. A few diplomatic catastrophes. A Scandinavian envoy once gifted a hunting horn to a Mediterranean monarch, unaware that horns there symbolised marital unfaithfulness. Entire negotiations stalled until scholars assured the monarch it wasn't an accusation. A European court gifted a tapestry showing the mythical triumph of their national hero, forgetting that the defeated villain in the tapestry resembled the receiving ruler's grandfather. A Mughal emperor was once offered a clock whose chime he found so irritating he declared it an omen of foreign incompetence. Even the value of the gift mattered. Too extravagant, and you implied the receiving nation was poor. Too humble, and you implied they weren't worth the effort. Some ambassadors spent months choosing diplomatic gifts, consulting astrologers, craftsmen, and professional flatterers to ensure no one misread their intention to be politely non-threatening. The spoken word. How to talk without saying anything damaging. Diplomatic speech was a delicate art. Envoys had to sound respectful without appearing cowardly, confident without appearing imperial, grateful without appearing desperate. The monarch, meanwhile, had to appear generous, wise, stable, and mildly intimidating. Statements like, "We greet your great nation with friendship," could be interpreted as, "You are not as great as ours." Statements like, "We hope for mutual understanding," could be interpreted as, "We do not trust you." A single misplaced adjective could spark diplomatic tension. One ambassador in an Italian court once praised a king by calling him a man of modest greatness. He meant humble. The king heard small. The ambassador apologised for a month. Ceremonial seating, standing, and the danger of the wrong chair. Every diplomatic meeting required a seating chart so rigid it made jailhouse schedules look flexible. Who sat closest to the monarch? Who sat at equal height? Who sat in a chair versus a stool versus a cushion? These decisions sent political messages more powerful than any speech. A famous disaster occurred when two ambassadors, one French, one Spanish, were accidentally assigned chairs of identical height. For decades, their countries had argued about precedence. A fight nearly broke out. Guards had to intervene. At one point, both ambassadors tried to sit first to claim symbolic superiority. Eventually, the monarch solved the crisis by removing both chairs entirely. Everyone stood. And the ambassadors absolutely hated it. Gesture mistakes that caused international tension. Some diplomatic mishaps were legendary. A Persian envoy once adjusted his robe during a blessing, mistakenly flashing the bottom of his foot, a grave insult in that court. A European envoy in an Asian court touched a sacred object without permission, prompting a full cleansing ritual and several apologies involving incense. An Ottoman envoy once bowed too deeply, causing his hat to fall off. The host nation interpreted this as mockery, because losing your hat was symbolic of losing one's composure or honour. And in one extraordinary and hilarious incident, A visiting noble in a northern European court sneezed directly toward the monarch during a diplomatic greeting. This did not cause war. But it did cause a 5-day pause in negotiations, while both sides debated whether the sneeze was symbolic, insulting, accidental, or possibly a new type of curse. Diplomacy required nerves of steel and the acting skills of a saint. Every gesture mattered. Every silence mattered. Every blink mattered. Foreign envoys entered the palace knowing one eternal truth. One wrong move, and your country might receive a very polite letter demanding explanations. If there was one job everyone at court avoided with the enthusiasm of a cat avoiding bathwater, it was delivering bad news to the monarch. Courts were happy places, not because monarchs were especially cheerful, but because courtiers worked tirelessly to ensure they never heard anything that might ruin their mood. Telling a king something unpleasant was a ritual that required courage, strategy, and the survival instinct of someone who liked keeping their head attached to their shoulders. Bad news didn't simply reach a monarch. It was packaged, filtered, polished, softened, decorated, rehearsed, diluted, reworded, and whispered through several layers of etiquette. A volcanic eruption could be described as a minor earthly enthusiasm. A military defeat might be a temporary geographical inconvenience. A treasury crisis could become an unexpected opportunity for financial creativity. Because the first rule of bad news at court was simple: never surprise the monarch. Monarchs did not like surprises. The ritual of delivering bad news, a performance of survival. Delivering bad news required preparation, not just emotional preparation, actual theatrical preparation. Step 1. Choose the messenger. Carefully. Bad news wasn't given by just anyone. It was delivered by the most senior advisor, the most loyal servant. A noble deemed expendable but eloquent, or occasionally the court jester, because if all else failed, he could pretend it was part of a joke. One king famously insisted that only his physician deliver bad news because he already understands pain. Step 2. Choose the timing. You did not deliver bad news before breakfast, during breakfast, after breakfast, when the monarch was tired, when the monarch was energetic, when the monarch was busy, or when the monarch was thinking, which left approximately 5 minutes per day when it was acceptable to approach. Step 3. Choose the tone. Bad news was delivered with gentleness bordering on spiritual. You had to sound respectful, calm, and somehow optimistic even if half the kingdom was underwater. The opening line often determined whether the monarch listened patiently or stared at you with the cold intensity of a disappointed ancestor. Openers included, "Your Majesty, fortune has offered us a challenge. An unexpected development has arisen which your wisdom will surely conquer. There is a matter which, through no fault of your shining leadership, requires your attention." Never open with, "You're not going to like this." Punishments for etiquette. Mistakes. The harsh, the soft, and the socially fatal. Not all etiquette mistakes were created equal. Some earned mild scoldings, others earned banishment. And some mistakes were so socially catastrophic that no legal punishment was required. The court would simply pretend you never existed. Let's begin with soft punishments, the royal equivalent of a disappointed glare from your grandmother. Soft punishments included being excluded from the next banquet, being assigned an inconvenient seat near a drafty window, being ignored for a week by everyone except servants, being forced to wait standing during ceremonies you normally sat through. These punishments stung, but they didn't ruin lives. They simply reminded you that the court was watching, judging, and taking notes. Moderate punishments were more serious. These included temporary removal from court duties, reassignment to a less glamorous region. Congratulations, you now oversee grain storage in a swamp. Loss of certain privileges, like speaking during audiences or sitting on specific chairs, being required to apologize publicly in a speech longer than the mistake itself. In French courts, nobles who committed etiquette sins sometimes had to perform exaggerated bows of apology, looking like elegant trees collapsing in slow motion. But then there were severe punishments, which were rarely written down but universally feared. Severe punishments included permanent exile from court, loss of titles or lands, house arrest, imprisonment for insubordination masked as clumsiness, forced retirement to a remote estate with no social life and too many sheep, and finally, the worst punishment of all, social annihilation. Social annihilation happened quietly. No one announced it. Instead, people stopped talking to you. Invitations ceased. Eyes slid past you at gatherings. Rumours sprouted like weeds. Your name slipped from conversations. You ceased to exist in the polite consciousness of the palace. This was the most devastating punishment because it destroyed what courtiers valued most: visibility, influence, and relevance. The art of surviving a royal scolding. Being scolded by royalty was a dangerous honour. You needed to appear contrite but not pathetic, attentive but not trembling, understanding but not presumptuous. If the monarch raised their voice, you lowered your head. If the monarch sighed dramatically, you sighed too, but respectfully. Key rules for surviving a royal scolding. Do not interrupt. Interrupting implied equal status. Equal status implied prison. Do not defend yourself too quickly. Defensiveness suggested guilt. Do not agree too enthusiastically. Too much agreement suggested sarcasm. Do not look directly into the monarch's eyes while being scolded. That was challenge energy. Apologize deeply, poetically, and repeatedly. A typical apology might sound like, "Your Majesty, my inadequacy pains my soul. I shall correct this failing with devotion worthy of your greatness." Never say, "My bad." Famously disastrous deliveries of bad news. Royal history is full of examples where bad news was delivered poorly, and the consequences were glorious disasters. A messenger in Persia once informed a king of a military defeat too bluntly. The king fainted from shock. The messenger was reassigned to goat herding. In medieval Europe, an advisor accidentally began his bad news with laughter. Nervous laughter, unfortunately. The king assumed mockery. The advisor was banished for inappropriate mirth. In an Asian court, a minister delivered bad news during the monarch's lunch. The monarch never forgave him, neither did the dumplings. In Mughal India, a noble began his bad news with a compliment so long that the emperor fell asleep before hearing the actual problem. The noble quietly left and pretended the conversation never happened. The lesson was universal. Bad news required artistry and nerves of iron. Why bad news was dangerous. The monarch's ego was part of the state. Monarchs were symbols of stability. If they appeared angry, panicked, or overwhelmed, the court trembled. Nobles panicked, and other nations began sharpening their opportunistic knives. So bad news wasn't simply unpleasant, it was dangerous. Thus, bad news had to be delivered gently, strategically, and wrapped in layers of, "Your Majesty, none of this is your fault," even when it absolutely was. In many courts it was considered safer to blame. The stars' weather, fate, mischievous spirits, geometry, general misfortune, than to imply the monarch had made a mistake. In the end, bad news was an art form. It was theatre, it was diplomacy, it was emotional gymnastics. The etiquette of punishment and bad news delivery reflected one timeless truth. Courts feared discomfort more than chaos. A monarch could tolerate war, famine, or rebellion, but not an awkward conversation. Royal courts were famous for their obsession with rules: bow rules, breathing rules, blinking rules, sitting rules, eating rules, touching rules, walking rules, and rules for pretending you weren't silently having an emotional meltdown under all those rules. But even the most rigid courts eventually faced the same universal truth. Some etiquette rules were too ridiculous for even royalty to keep pretending they made sense. This final chapter is about the rules that didn't just fade, they collapsed, evaporated, self-destructed, or were yeeted out of existence when everyone collectively admitted, "Actually, this is insane." Let's begin with one of the most legendary casualties, The rule of court's silence so strict that even breathing was regulated. For centuries, some courts demanded absolute sonic purity. No coughing, no shoe scuffing, no sighing, no throat clearing. In one European court, a noble was reprimanded for blinking too loudly, a feat we must assume required supernatural eyelids. But eventually even monarchs realised that running a state full of people terrified of exhaling was impractical. After several fainting incidents, including one during a treaty signing where a diplomat collapsed like a stunned goat, the rule was quietly replaced with a more reasonable standard. Try to be quietish unless the monarch is already yelling. Another rule that perished spectacularly was never turn your back on the monarch. While the intention behind this rule was reverence, its practical effects were ridiculous. Courtiers crab-walked out of rooms sideways, backwards, diagonally. Anything to avoid showing the royal gaze their treasonous spines. Injuries were common. Walls did most of the damage. People fell into decorative fountains so often they became part of the entertainment. The final straw came when a high-ranking noble, attempting a graceful backwards exit, tripped over a footstool and knocked over an entire candelabrum that nearly set the monarch's dog on fire. After that incident, the monarch issued a new rule. You may turn around, the dog has suffered enough. Then there was the deeply dramatic, deeply doomed requirement, never touch the monarch's food or plate. This rule survived impressively long considering how many monarchs allegedly feared poison. Only certain attendants could handle royal dishes, everyone else had to pretend food was radioactive. Unfortunately, extreme enforcement created unintended chaos. In one Renaissance court, a prince accidentally dripped sauce on the king's platter and, terrified of the consequences, tried to wipe it off with his sleeve. Witnesses described the scene as a combination of panic, gravy, and spiritual crisis. Eventually, monarchs relaxed the rule, realizing that refusing to let anyone near your plate made eating very lonely and occasionally logistically impossible. Another rule that died a hilariously slow death was the monarch must always receive the first laugh. For centuries, courtiers were forbidden to laugh before the monarch did. Jokes were delivered like landmines. Everyone waited for the royal facial expression before daring to make a sound. The problem? Some monarchs were terrible at timing their reactions. One king was known for not laughing at jokes until several minutes later, long after everyone else had forgotten the punchline. Court humour became an endurance sport. This rule collapsed when a noblewoman accidentally laughed earlier at a joke involving a goat and a bishop. The court froze. The king froze. The noblewoman froze. Then the king began laughing so hysterically he couldn't stop. Not from humour, but because the idea of someone laughing before he did was so ridiculous that it broke his royal composure entirely. Afterward, he proclaimed, "Fine, laugh whenever you wish, just not during funerals." A particularly absurd rule that died a richly deserved death was, the monarch must never be seen eating. This rule existed in various courts where kings or emperors were considered semi-divine, and therefore above mortal needs like chewing. As a result, monarchs ate alone behind screens or curtains, while courtiers listened to the deeply unholy sounds of royal mastication echoing from behind velvet drapes. Problems emerged when monarchs had to host diplomatic banquets. How do you impress foreign guests if you cannot actually appear at the table? One emperor attempted to sit behind a hanging tapestry with his arm poking through like a puppet, reaching for dishes. A foreign ambassador famously asked, "Is the emperor here? Or is this some sort of ceremonial arm?" The rule ended when a monarch, tired of eating in secret like a soft-bodied woodland creature, dramatically shoved the curtain aside one evening and proclaimed, "If the people cannot handle seeing me chew, they may eat in the dark themselves." A round of applause followed, cautiously of course. Then there was the fashion rule that even nobility grew tired of. You must wear fabrics that do not allow you to sit comfortably. Court fashion was notoriously painful, but some eras took it to gladiatorial levels. Corsets so tight they reduced lung capacity by half. Sleeves so wide they could function as parachutes. Wigs so tall they altered atmospheric pressure. outfits so decorated they jingled ominously when nobles walked. The breaking point came during a winter festival where a noblewoman's gown, structured like an architectural marvel, was so wide she blocked an entire doorway. Nobles trapped behind her staged a polite but desperate rebellion. The court seamstresses declared the fashion officially incompatible with survival, and thus the rule quietly died. But nothing, and absolutely nothing, had collapsed as spectacularly as the etiquette of the royal wake-up choir. Some courts once required attendants to greet the monarch each morning, with soft singing, chanting, or poetic recitations. In theory, it was meant to wake the sovereign gently. In practice, it was a pre-coffee nightmare. One famously grumpy monarch woke to what he described as the sound of frightened birds attempting opera, panicked, and hurled a jewelled clock at the wall. The next day he banned musical wake-up calls indefinitely, saying, "Anyone who sings at dawn will join the choir in the dungeon," and the rule never returned. The grand conclusion, when even royalty said enough. Etiquette rules were often born from symbolism, devotion, and hierarchy, but the ones that died? They died because royalty, even with absolute power, eventually realised it was impossible to run a kingdom while fainting courtiers lay everywhere. It was impractical to insist no one blink within a 2-metre radius. It was absurd to pretend monarchs did not chew, sneeze, or accidentally trip. And above all, too many rules made everyone miserable, even the people who wrote them. These extinct etiquette rules stand as historical proof that even in the most rigid courts, reality eventually wins, and that sometimes the most powerful words a monarch could speak were, "Okay, even we can't do this anymore."